I arrived at the gala, celebrating the company I had spent my entire life building. My son walked over and said, "You'll be more comfortable at the table by the kitchen door. After all, you're used to being near where the cooking happens. This seat is for my father-in-law." The entire room burst into laughter. I looked at the massive banner hanging behind the stage, where his name was printed in giant letters, while mine had completely disappeared. I simply nodded and took my seat, because no one in that room had any idea what was about to happen that night. This one starts quietly, but what it reveals runs deep. Before we begin, drop a quick comment. How are you feeling right now? One word is enough. I read everyone and your thoughts matter. Some details have been shaped for storytelling purposes. The lesson at the heart of this, that's what I hope stays with you. At 68, I learned 2 words on an invitation can tell you everything a son won't say to your face, +1. I sat at my Brenham Ranch's oak kitchen table, calloused hands wrapped around lukewarm black coffee, staring at an ivory envelope. The embossed gold logo, Rose's Premier Catering, caught the Texas light. I'd paid for that logo back in 1983, 40 years ago, before we even had a permanent kitchen, back when the company was ours. The elegant text read, "Rose's Premier Catering cordially invites you to celebrate Executive Leadership Excellence at the Ember Room, Houston, Friday, November 7th, 2023, black tie." Below that in smaller font, Arthur Sutton +1. Not founder, not owner, not the man who took out a $3 million loan against his life insurance to fund the expansion that made all this possible. Just +1. Dwight's name appeared twice as host and honoree. Mine wasn't printed at all. This was the 3rd erasure. First was the website redesign, 18 months ago, relegating me to a single line, founded in 1983, while Dwight's bio ran 3 paragraphs. Second was the annual report summarizing my contribution as legacy support, while Dwight claimed unprecedented growth under his sole direction. Now this. I'd signed over operational control 3 years ago when Rose got sick, thinking I was letting my son prove himself while I focused on her final months. I thought I was building a legacy. Instead, I'd built his empire. Rose would have seen this coming. Before she passed in September to 2020, she gripped my hand. "Don't let him forget who paid for the kitchen, Arthur." I walked into the quiet bedroom. Rose had been gone 3 years, but her nightstand remained untouched. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a navy velvet box containing her watch still ticking after 41 years. "Give it to Dwight when he settles down," she'd told me. "When he earns it, when he's ready." Rose knew you judged readiness by how someone treated the dishwashers and how they spoke about those who helped them get there. I slipped the box into my vest pocket. The gala was in 3 days. Dwight's celebration, his empire. Except it wasn't his. Not until I said so. Tonight my son would make a choice he didn't know he was making. He would either honor the man who built the foundation he stood on, or cement the erasure he'd practiced for 3 years. I would be watching, waiting to see if he had earned the legacy she left behind. But before the gala, I had 2 more calls to make, and neither was to my son. The hardest call a father can make is the one where he asks his younger son to watch his older son's empire collapse. I sat on my back porch Tuesday afternoon, phone heavy in my hand. The first call would be to Bobby. The second would be to my attorney. One would bring me a witness. The other would bring me a weapon. I dialed Dallas. Bobby answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad. 34 years old, my younger son a civil engineer with a good head and a better heart. He'd built bridges in 3 states, never forgot to call his mother on Sundays, even after she couldn't remember his name. The kind of son who showed up to things. I need you at the Ember Room this Friday at 7, I said. Houston, don't mention it to Dwight." Silence on the line, not confused, calculating. "What's going on, Dad?" "Nothing yet," I said, "but there will be." Another pause. I didn't get an invitation. There it was. Bobby hadn't been excluded by accident. Dwight had deliberately left his own brother off the guest list for the biggest event in the company's history. The company their mother had named. The company Bobby had helped pack trucks for during summer breaks while Dwight networked at country clubs. "I know," I said quietly. "That's why I'm calling. Is this about the gala Dwight's big night, seek per seas, trees, per fistasin?" "It's about a lot of things." I watched a hawk circle over the far fence. "I can't explain it over the phone, son. I just need you there. Can you do that for me?" I heard him exhale, heard the shift in his voice, the same shift from 3 years ago, when I called to tell him his mother had hours, not days. That edge that said he understood this wasn't a request, it was a reckoning. At what time do you need me? At 7 sharp. Come alone. Park on the north side, Travis Street. Don't use the main entrance. Dead us fairly, I said. 7 p.m., trust me. Bobby didn't ask questions. That was one of the things I loved about my younger son. He showed up first and asked later. I'll be there, he said. I hung up and sat with the phone in my lap, listening to the wind move through the live oaks. One call down. One son secured. Now I needed to make sure the paperwork was airtight. Wednesday morning, I drove 90 miles to Austin. Estelle Lang's office sat on the 12th floor of a glass building on Congress Avenue. I'd been paying Estelle for 14 years, since the day I incorporated Rose's premier catering, and needed someone who understood the difference between building a business and protecting it. She met me in the lobby herself, 58, with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses on a silver chain. She'd spent the last 6 months preparing documents she'd always hoped would never leave her desk. Arthur? She shook my hand, her grip firm. Come on back. Her office overlooked the Capitol building. On her walnut desk sat a navy leather folder, the kind lawyers use for contracts you didn't want to lose. I knew what was inside without opening it. I'd been building that file for 9 years, ever since Dwight signed the operating agreement that made him managing operator and me the sole equity holder. I sat across from her. She didn't waste time. The operating agreement is notarized and filed, she said, tapping the folder. 9 years of corporate tracking every signature Dwight made, acknowledging zero equity ownership. The immediate removal notice was drafted 2 weeks ago after Opal called me about the discrepancies. Opal Flynn, my operations manager, the one person in that building who still remembered I existed. She'd found $340,000 in fraudulent expense reports Dwight's personal spending run through the corporate account like his private wallet. And the Meridian contract, I asked. Estelle opened the folder, slid a highlighted copy across the desk. Forged signature. Your name is handwriting. Forensic analysis confirms it. It'll hold up. I stared at the contract at my own name, written in my son's hand. He'd signed my name to a $2.8 million deal without my knowledge, then told the client I was too old to handle negotiations. You want me to file Friday night? Estelle asked. After the dinner, I said. After he makes his speech. She leaned back, studying me over her glasses. You're sure you could file tomorrow, lock him out before the event? He needs witnesses, I said flatly. So do I. She nodded slowly, understanding. This wasn't about the money or the company. This was about the moment. The public moment when a son who'd spent 3 years erasing his father would stand in front of everyone and hear the truth read aloud. I'll be there, she said. South entrance 9:30 p.m. That gives him time to finish his toast. The folder weighed almost nothing. 9 years of my life, portable enough to fit in a leather case. Estelle slid it across the desk. I picked it up, felt the smooth leather under my calloused fingers, the brass clasp cool to the touch. Inside this case was every signature, every acknowledgement, every lie Dwight had built his empire on. Arthur, Estelle said quietly, are you ready for what happens after? I stood tucking the folder under my arm. I've been ready for 3 years. I walked out and drove the 90 miles home, the Navy folder on the passenger seat like a sleeping weapon. I had 3 days before Friday night. 3 days before Dwight would stand in front of 20 investors and tell them how he'd built an empire from nothing. And I would be sitting by the kitchen door with Rose's watch in one pocket and 9 years of signed agreements in the other, waiting for the exact right moment to show my son what nothing actually looked like. But before Friday's reckoning, there was a story Dwight didn't know, a story that started 52 years ago, with a cracked hickory-handled knife. Everything I built started with a cracked hickory-handled knife, and a man who believed silence was a skill. Summer, 1971, Beaumont, Texas. At 16, I washed dishes in a cramped, unair-conditioned BBQ shack for $2 an hour. Grease burns crawled up my arms from scrubbing cast iron. The air tasted like mesquite and sweat. I never complained. Not when the sink flooded ankle-deep, nor when hands cracked from industrial soap. 3 weeks in head chef, Earl Gaines noticed. Earl was 60, a towering pitmaster with hands like bark and a voice like gravel. He ran that shack like a church, no shouting, no shortcuts. If you couldn't handle it, he just stopped looking at you until you left. But Earl looked at me. One Tuesday, he approached, silently pulled a boning knife from his leather roll, and slid it across the stainless steel counter. The handle was split hickory bound with electrical tape. "You don't complain," he said flatly. "That's rarer than talent. Take care of it, it'll take care of you." 52 years later, that knife still rests in my Brenham Ranch kitchen. Earl never said he believed in me. He just handed me a tool and got out of the way. 40 years later, I tried doing the same for my son. The difference was, Earl never asked for the knife back. Earl taught me a principle: keep your head down, do the work, and let the product speak. By 19, I could break down a brisket in 4 minutes. I worked every Texas kitchen job available. Rose met me in 1979 at a Houston catering gig. Handing me water during a 100-degree outdoor wedding, she said, "You're too good for this place." We married 3 years later. By 1989, saving $12,000, we opened Sutton Smokehouse in San Antonio. Rose managed the books, I ran the pit. We survived near bankruptcies, a 2001 warehouse fire, and a partner's 1997 embezzlement. Rose stood by me through every missed payroll. By 2015, we had a small BBQ empire across 3 locations. Then came Rose's diagnosis, stage 4, inoperable. I sold the entire chain for $6.2 million immediately. "I wanted to be home," I said. Rose passed in September 2020. I sat with her every day of those final months, holding hands and remembering when we were young. Some lessons you learn in kitchens. Some you learn when the boy you raise treats your life's work like a spent inheritance. In 2016, I used $3 million from that sale to establish Rose's premier catering, LLC, gifting it entirely to Dwight to run. No equity protection, no safeguards. I wanted to do for him what Earl did for me, hand over the tools and step back. I didn't realize Rose had noticed something I missed. Something that started the first night we sat across from Victor and Eleanor Greer at Morton's Steakhouse. The Greers had circled my recipes for 25 years, and Dwight had just married their daughter. Rose always knew when someone was looking at you versus looking through you to what you owned. June 2019, Morton's The Steakhouse, Houston. Dwight had called 3 days before, asking if Rose and I could meet his girlfriend's family. "Her father's Victor Greer," he'd said, "owns a hotel chain." We sat at a dimly lit corner table. Victor Greer was 61 that summer, broad-shouldered in an expensive suit that didn't quite hide the calculation in his eyes. When he shook my hand, his grip was 3 seconds too long. "Arthur Sutton," he said, locking eyes with me. "Interesting. Not nice to meet you. Just interesting." Like he'd been waiting to confirm something he'd already known. Eleanor Greer, 57, sat beside him with the tight smile women perfected at country club luncheons. She asked polite questions where we were from what I did for work. When I said retired cook, I watched her expression shift. Not disgust. Just the subtle rearrangement of someone filing a person into a lower social drawer. Across from me sat Iris Greer, 30 years old, blonde hair, pulled back designer dress, diamond earrings catching the low light. She gripped Dwight's arm the entire dinner like a woman displaying proof of conquest. Her eyes never quite met mine, just constantly measured the restaurant, the wine, the other tables, everything except the man she was about to marry. Rose barely spoke. She smiled when appropriate, but I felt her hand tighten around mine under the table. Victor dominated the conversation. He talked about his hotel chain, 17 locations across Texas and Oklahoma. He asked about my background, and when I mentioned selling my BBQ restaurants, his eyes sharpened. "That's Sutton's Smokehouse," he said. "San Antonio, Austin, Houston, I remember. You had that brisket recipe everyone tried to copy. That was a long time ago." "Good recipes don't get old," Victor said. "They just get more valuable." Rose's hand tightened again. In the parking lot afterward, Dwight and Iris walked ahead. Rose turned to me in the passenger seat, her face lit by yellow streetlights, eyes heavy with something I'd later recognize as fear. "Dwight is blind, Arthur," she said quietly. "That girl is looking at the corporate registry. She isn't looking at our son." I patted her hand, started the engine. "You're just worrying too much, honey." Rose passed away 15 months later, September 2020, 47 times. I'd counted. 47 moments since Rose died where I thought she told me. She told me, and I patted her hand like she was being dramatic. Rose was never dramatic. She was just right before the rest of us were ready to hear it. May 2023, 6 months before the gala. Opal Flynn requested a private meeting, not during office hours after. The email came at 4 p.m., "Need to speak with you tonight," third floor, just us. Opal had been the company controller since we'd founded Rose's Premier Catering in 2016. 52 years old, methodical, the kind of woman who triple-checked numbers before signing anything. When she discovered the wire transfers in January, she'd spent 4 months verifying every transaction before she finally came to me. I met her at 8 p.m. The building was empty except for the glow under her office door. She sat behind her desk, laptop turned toward the empty chair. I sat down without a word. She turned the screen toward me, a spreadsheet, rows of numbers, dates, transaction codes, one column highlighted in yellow. $340,000, she said barely above a whisper. Systematically transferred from our primary operating account into a shell LLC over 8 months. The company is called DCR Consulting. I stared at the screen. 18 separate transfers from September 2022 through April 2023, $12,000 to $32,000 each. No invoices, no services rendered, no contracts. Who owns DCR Consultings? I asked, though I already knew. Opal clicked to another tab. Texas Secretary of State Business Registry. DCR Consulting LLC, registered agent Dwight R. Sutton. I sat in silence for 2 full minutes. Just stared at my son's name on that screen, at the initials he had chosen for his theft. Dwight Cole Sutton, using his middle name like a signature on his own betrayal. Opal's voice cracked. I've been tracking it for 4 months. I didn't know who else to tell. I placed a hand on her shoulder. You did the right thing. Don't change a thing. Don't tell anyone. Keep tracking. What are you going to do? I stood looking down at the numbers one more time. $340,000. Not a single impulsive mistake. Not a moment of weakness. This was methodical. 8 months of deliberate theft from the company I'd built with his mother's name. I'd spent 52 years learning how to read a kitchen, how to see when a line cook was stealing, when a partner was skimming, when the numbers didn't balance. But I couldn't see my own son's hands in the register. I'm going to make sure it stops, I said. I walked out, drove onto the highway toward Brenham, and pulled over at the first rest stop to call Estelle Lang. Told her everything that transfers the shell company Dwight's name on every document. How long do you need to build the case? I asked. 2 weeks for removal documents, she said. But if you're serious about this, we need witnesses. People who saw what you built before he tried to erase you. $340,000, not from a stranger. From the boy I taught to shake hands and look people in the eye. I drove home and didn't turn the radio on once. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd already made 2 decisions. Estelle would prepare the legal framework, and when the time came, I'd need witnesses, people who'd seen what I'd built before. Dwight tried to erase me from it. One of those witnesses had started as my dishwasher 20 years ago, and now ran the finest restaurant in Houston. Some debts you spend your whole life being glad you made. Reed Nash had washed dishes in my San Antonio kitchen 23 years ago. 19 years old, no family sleeping in his car behind the restaurant. I'd given him the graveyard shift, watched him scrub pans until his hands bled, never once complaining about the heat or the hours or the burns crawling up his forearms. At 21, I taught him to break down his first brisket. At 25, when no bank would look at him, I wrote him a $50,000 check interest-free handshake, only to open his own place. He'd repaid every cent within 4 years. But some debts don't live in ledgers. October 2023, 2 weeks before the gala, I called him. We met at the Ember Room after closing. The dining hall was empty chairs upturned on tables, the only light coming from amber pendant lamps over the bar. Reed poured 2 glasses of high-end Texas bourbon and slid one across the polished wood. He was 42, now lean and confident, running what Food and Wine had called Houston's finest restaurant. But when he looked at me, I still saw the kid who'd slept in his car. Chef, he said quietly. No preamble, no small talk. Just respect. I told him everything. The fraud Opal had uncovered, the shell company, all of it. The operating agreement I'd signed in 2016, showing 0% equity for my son. Estelle Lang's removal strategy, the timeline, the plan, to wait until after Dwight's victory speech to execute the legal takedown. Reed listened without interrupting. Didn't touch his bourbon. Just watched me with the kind of attention you only get from someone who understands what it costs to build something from nothing. When I finished, he set his glass down calmly. Esti chef, you know Dwight booked my entire main dining hall for this contract party, right? I I nodded. I know. He'd known? He'd been waiting for my call. That's when I understood Reed had seen what I'd been too blind to see. He'd watched Dwight erase my name from the invitations, heard him claim sole credit, noticed the absence of the man who'd funded it all. Reed leaned forward. What do you want me to do? I met his eyes. Just one thing. If I'm not seated at the main table, upgrade wherever they put me. And when the time is right, step out. He didn't ask why, didn't ask for details, didn't question whether I was sure. And consider it done, he said. We didn't shake hands, didn't toast. Reed just nodded, once the same nod he'd given me 20 years ago when I'd handed him that check and told him to build something worth keeping. Reed Nash had started as my dishwasher when he was 19 years old. Now he ran the best restaurant in Houston. Thursday night, November 6th, 2023, my ranch kitchen in Brenham. I stood at the ironing board, carefully pressing the suit I'd worn to Dwight's wedding in 2018. Navy blue, single-breasted, the same one Dwight had seen me in that morning, and said, "Dad, you look like a real gentleman." I wondered if he'd remember. I hung the suit on the bedroom door, then walked back to the kitchen and pulled the navy velvet box from Rose's nightstand drawer. Under the dim overhead light, I opened it one more time. The Omega Seamaster glowed softly, the silver face catching the light, the second hand still ticking after 41 years. I turned it over. The inscription was still clear, engraved in Rose's careful script, A and R Forever, 1982. I'd given this watch to her on our wedding day. She'd worn it every single day until the hospital took it off her wrist in those final weeks. She'd told me to give it to Dwight when he was ready. I closed the box and slid it deep into the interior breast pocket of my suit jacket. Not a gift anymore, a test. Above the sink on the wooden rack I'd built in 1989 rested Earl Gaines's old boning knife. The hickory handle was still split at the base, held together now with newer tape. The blade had been sharpened so many times over 52 years, it was thin as parchment. But the edge remained perfect, sharp enough to split a hair, just like the day Earl had slid it across that steel counter in Beaumont. I stood there for a long moment looking at that knife. It had traveled with me through every kitchen, every restaurant, every expansion. It had seen me build Sutton Smokehouse from nothing. It had been there when I taught Dwight to dice onions at age 12, when I showed him how to read smoke at 15. That knife was the foundation of everything I'd become. But tonight it would stay home. I looked at Earl's knife one last time. 52 years on that shelf. It had seen everything I'd built. Tonight it would stay home. What I needed was already in my pocket, and it had been sharpened by 40 years of doing the right thing when nobody was watching. I picked up my keys and slipped the Navy folder into my leather tote. On top of the folder, Estelle's removal documents, the operating agreement, 9 years of corporate tracking forensic analysis of the Forge Meridian contract. Evidence, not steel. I walked out to my truck. The November air was cold and dry, the kind of Texas autumn night where you could see every star. I didn't look back at the ranch house, didn't second-guess the folder or the watch or the choice I'd made to leave the knife behind. The engine turned over smooth. I pulled onto the highway headlights, cutting through the dark. By Friday night, Dwight would understand the difference between what you build with your hands and what you steal with a signature. 20 miles down the highway toward Houston, I realized I was driving to my own son's public execution, and I hadn't shed a single tear. I'd funded every dollar that paid for that banner, and my name wasn't on it. I arrived at the Ember Room at 7 p.m. sharp, 20 minutes early, and parked at the far edge of the lot. The November air was cold and dry, my breath visible in the yellow glow of the streetlights. Through the massive industrial windows, I could see the private dining hall inside, chandeliers throwing warm light across white linens, servers moving between tables with military precision. And above the banquet table, hanging from brass chains bolted into the exposed brick ceiling, was an 8-foot banner in black and gold lettering, Dwight Sutton's Rose's Premier, Catering Celebrating the Meridian Contract. The letters were massive, bold, accented in metallic gold that caught the light like a trophy. Dwight's name was printed twice as large as the company name itself. His name, not mine, not Rose's, his. I stood in that parking lot with my hands in my coat pockets, the velvet box pressing against my chest through my vest, and read that banner 3 times. Not because I couldn't believe it, because I wanted to make sure I'd remember it exactly. Dwight Sutton's Rose's Premier Catering. Possessive, ownership, claim. I wasn't surprised. I'd expected this. But there's a difference between expecting something and seeing it printed in black and gold at 8 feet tall, hanging above 20 place settings like a coronation announcement. $3 million, 44 years of smoke and grease and early mornings. Rose's name on the LLAC paperwork because she'd insisted, "This one's for both of us, Arthur, our legacy." And Dwight had turned it into his. I stood in that parking lot for 5 full minutes. Not because I was afraid, because I was reading that banner one more time, committing every letter to memory proof that my son had erased me so completely he'd put it in writing 8 feet tall. Then I walked inside. The hostess met me at the entrance mid-30s, professionally polite, wearing the kind of careful neutral expression that told me she'd been given very specific instructions about where the old man in the corner was supposed to sit. "Good evening, Mr. Sutton," she said, her smile practiced but not unkind. "Right this way, please." She guided me through the oak doors into the opulent private dining room. The space was stunning, exposed brick walls, Edison bulbs hanging from black iron fixtures, a long banquet table set for 20, with immaculate white linens and heavy brass candelabras. At every seat sat a polished brass name card engraved gleaming under the soft light. I walked slowly along the entire length of the table, reading each one. Dwight Sutton at the head, Iris Greer Sutton to his right, Victor Greer in the seat of honor to Dwight's left. Not just any seat, but the one reserved for the most important guest, the investor, the man whose approval mattered most. I paused at Victor's card. It looked newer than the others, the brass slightly brighter, as if it had been swapped out recently. Last-minute change, deliberate positioning. Eleanor Greer beside her husband, then Meridian executives I didn't recognize. Nola Crane near the middle. A few others investors probably, or clients Dwight wanted to impress. 20 brass cards total. I read every single one. My name wasn't there. The hostess cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Sutton, your seat is over here." She gestured toward a small, isolated table positioned directly beside the swinging kitchen doors. Not part of the banquet arrangement, not included in the carefully orchestrated seating chart. Just a separate afterthought table with 2 chairs tucked against the wall like furniture waiting to be stored. I walked over and sat down. The linen was standard white cotton, not the fine Egyptian blend on the main table. The cutlery was basic stainless steel, not the heavy silver, with Rose's Premier Catering engraved on the handles. The glassware was cheap, the kind you bought in bulk, and didn't care if it broke. The draft hit my neck the moment a server pushed through the kitchen doors. Cold air from the industrial dishwashing station, the smell of lemon sanitizer and steam. They'd put me by the kitchen door. I'd eaten at worse tables. Hell, I'd washed dishes at worse tables. Started my entire career standing in front of sinks just like the one 15 feet behind me. But I'd never been seated away from my own company's party before. I unfolded the napkin-thin standard restaurant issue and placed it across my lap, adjusted my chair slightly to the right, tested the angle. And that's when I noticed, from this specific position tucked against the wall beside the kitchen entrance, I had an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire main table. Every seat, every face, every gesture. I could see Dwight's chair at the head, Victor's seat of honor, Iris's position of display. I could see who leaned toward whom, who whispered, who smiled, who didn't. They'd exiled me to the corner by the kitchen door. What they didn't know was that's exactly where I'd spent the last 52 years, watching, learning, waiting for the moment the line fell apart. Earl had taught me that. You don't need to be at the head of the table to see who's stealing from the register. You just need to be in the right position when they stop looking over their shoulder. I settled into my chair, feeling the velvet box press against my ribs, the navy folder safe in my leather tote beside my feet. The draft hit my neck again as a server pushed through carrying a tray of champagne flutes. I didn't reach for one, just sat still, hands folded on the table, and started watching. From here I could see everything. And the first thing I saw was Eleanor Greer whispering to her wealthy socialite friend, gesturing discreetly toward my table, with a smile I'd seen before, the one she'd given me at Morton's, when I'd said, "retired cook." They were rewriting who I was in real time, and the people listening had never built a thing in their lives. Eleanor Greer leaned closer to the woman, beside her perfectly coiffed hair, diamond bracelet catching the candlelight, the kind of socialite who measured worth in country club memberships and charity galas. Eleanor gestured discreetly toward my table with a practiced smile, her lips moving in that careful way wealthy women perfected when they wanted to gossip without being obvious. I couldn't hear the words over the ambient noise of the room, clinking glasses lows, conversation servers, moving between tables with trays of champagne. But I didn't need to hear. I'd seen that smile before. At Morton's, when I'd said, "retired cook." A young server appeared at my table, water pitcher in hand. He refilled my glass with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, then leaned down slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I overheard Mrs. Greer tell her guest that you're just the old handyman who helped build out the first kitchen line. She told her Dwight keeps you around out of pure family charity." Ryan was mid-20s, clean-cut, wearing the black vest and white shirt of the Ember Room's service staff. He straightened up water pitcher, steady in his hand, his face professionally neutral in case anyone was watching. I looked up at him calmly. "Thank you for letting me know." He didn't move away, just shifted the pitcher slightly, adjusting the angle like he was checking the water level, and leaned down one more time. "My dad ate at your San Antonio pit every Friday for 10 years. Chef," he said quietly, intensity breaking through the professional mask. "He always said it was the finest brisket in the state of Texas." I offered a tight, appreciative nod. Ryan nodded back once sharp, the kind of acknowledgement that passed between people who understood what it meant to build something with your hands and have someone else try to take credit for it. He walked away, disappearing back toward the kitchen. The working-class staff knew exactly who I was. They'd treat me accordingly, regardless of what Eleanor Greer told her socialite circle. Dwight told his wife's family I was the handyman, not the founder, not the man who wrote the first check, the handyman. I picked up my water glass and took a long, slow sip. 7:20 p.m. Across the dining room, Iris Greer Sutton floated between tables like she owned the building. She greeted guests with perfectly practiced smiles, air-kissed cheeks gestured toward centerpieces and wine selections like she'd personally curated every detail. The actual event coordinators, 2 women in black dresses holding clipboards, stood near the wall, watching her with the resigned patience of professionals who'd learned when to step back and let the client's wife play host. Iris was 31 now. 5 years since that dinner at Morton's. 3 years since she'd married my son. I watched her move through the room, and my mind cut sharp back to the parking lot that June night in 2019. The yellow streetlights, the cold steering wheel under my hands. Rose turning to me in the passenger seat, her face lit by the dashboard glow, her eyes carrying that particular weight I'd learned to recognize over 40 years of marriage, the look that said she'd seen something I'd missed. "Dwight is blind, Arthur," she'd said quietly. "That girl is looking at the corporate registry. She isn't looking at our son." I'd patted her hand, started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot like her concern was nothing more than motherly worry. "You're just worrying too much, honey." Rose passed away 15 months later. September 2020 held my hand until the morphine pulled her under for the last time. 47 times since she died, I'd thought about that parking lot, about the words I should have listened to. Tonight would be the last time I counted. I sat at my isolated table beside the kitchen door, the draft hitting my neck every time a server pushed through, and watched Iris laugh with Victor Greer's business associates like she'd been born into this world instead of married into it. Rose had seen it. That first dinner at Morton's, she'd watched Iris measure the wine, the restaurant, the other diners, everything except Dwight's face. She'd watched Victor's too tight handshake, and Eleanor's dismissive smile, and the way Iris gripped Dwight's arm like proof of ownership. And I'd driven home thinking Rose was just being protective. She'd tried to warn me about Victor too, about the way his eyes had sharpened when I mentioned selling the BBQ restaurants, about his comment, "Good recipes don't get old, they just get more valuable." 25 years Victor had been circling, waiting for another chance at the brisket recipe that had made Sutton's Smokehouse a legend, and I'd handed him the perfect entry point when Dwight married his daughter. I pressed my forearm against my vest, feeling the outline of the velvet box through the fabric. The Omega Seamaster was still there, still ticking the inscription, still clear on the back, A and R Forever, 1982. Rose had told me to give it to Dwight when he was ready, when he'd earned it, when he understood what family meant. 47 times I'd remembered her warning. 47 times I'd thought about that parking lot at Morton's, and the words I should have listened to. Tonight would be the last time I counted. Tonight Rose would get her answer about whether our son had earned what she left behind. I took another sip of water, set the glass down precisely in the center of the cheap paper coaster, and kept watching. And then Dwight stood up at the head of the table, tapping his knife against crystal, ready to tell 20 guests how he built everything from nothing. He had cropped me out of our own photograph, not metaphorically, literally. The crystal rang clear as Dwight tapped his knife against it, commanding the room to silence. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne flutes lowered to the table. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward the head of the banquet table, where my son stood in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His hair styled, his smile practiced, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who believed every word he was about to say. Behind him, the massive LED presentation screen powered up with a slick corporate slideshow. The first slide appeared in crisp professional graphics, Our Story, founded by Dwight Sutton, 2016. Then the photograph. I recognized it instantly. Opening day, Rose's Premier Catering's inaugural commercial kitchen, the stainless steel prep stations gleaming under the fluorescent lights, the new equipment still wrapped in protective plastic, the smell of fresh paint and possibility. Opal had taken that photo on our first morning of operation. 7 a.m., September 12th, 2016. She'd lined us up in front of the main prep counter, told us to smile, captured the moment we'd worked 6 months to reach. In the original photograph, I stood directly beside Dwight 2 feet to his right, holding a massive prep spatula and grinning like a man who just built something worth keeping. In the photograph on the screen, I was gone, cleanly professionally removed, not cropped carelessly at the edge, digitally erased, photoshopped out with the precision of someone who'd paid money to delete me from our own history. Dwight stood alone in that kitchen, centered in the frame, smiling at the camera like he'd done it all himself. I started this company with nothing but a vision, Dwight said, smoothly gesturing toward the screen, and a willingness to outwork everyone in this room. Applause rippled through the guests. Victor Greer nodded approvingly. Eleanor smiled that tight, satisfied smile. Iris beamed at her husband like he'd just announced a papal appointment. I sat at my side table by the kitchen door and stared at that photograph, at the empty space where I should have been standing, at the kitchen I'd helped design, at the equipment I'd personally selected and paid for. I'd been standing 2 feet to his right in that photograph, holding a spatula, wearing the same old suit I had on tonight. The original was still framed in my kitchen in Brenham, hanging on the wall beside Earl's knife. Dwight had spent money to hire someone to delete me from our own history. I locked eyes with Reed Nash standing by the kitchen pass, arms crossed watching the presentation, with the particular stillness of someone who knew exactly what they were witnessing. Reed gave me a slow, imperceptible nod. I nodded back. 35 minutes earlier, 7:10 p.m. I'd walked into the Ember Room's dining hall and started toward the main table, reading the brass name cards, searching for my seat among the 20-place settings. Dwight intercepted me before I got halfway there. His voice was loud enough to carry across the entire space, projecting with the practiced volume of someone who wanted an audience. He swirled a glass of expensive champagne in his hand, the kind that cost $40 a pour. "Dad," Dwight's voice carried across the room, loud enough for every investor at that table to hear. He walked toward me, champagne glass in one hand, the other already reaching for the back of my chair. He pulled it out from under me, before I'd even fully sat down. "This seat is for Victor," he said flatly. No smile this time, no corporate warmth. Just the plain public fact of it delivered like a business decision. "Victor Greer is joining our board tonight. He sits here at my left. That's how it's going to be." He set the chair down 2 feet away, pointed it toward the wall. "There's a table for you by the kitchen door, Dad. You'll be comfortable there." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people pretending not to listen, the held breath quiet of people who just witnessed something they couldn't unhear. Victor Greer stepped forward without a word and lowered himself into my chair. My chair. The one at Dwight's left that should have belonged to the man who signed the first check, who borrowed $3 million against his own life to fund this room, this table, this night. Victor picked up the linen napkin and spread it across his lap like he'd been sitting there for years. Eleanor Greer tilted her head toward her socialite friend, with that thin smile I'd seen at Morton's, the one that said, "Tolerated, not respected." I stood there in the middle of that dining room, 68 years old, holding nothing, while my son pointed me toward the kitchen door like a delivery man who'd already been paid and needed to clear the entrance. I looked at Dwight for 3 full seconds. He held my gaze without flinching. No guilt, no hesitation, just certainty, the certainty of a man who'd already decided his father was furniture. "Of course, son," I said quietly. 2 words. I turned and walked to the table by the kitchen door. Every guest in that room watched me cross the hardwood floor in silence. 20 pairs of eyes, 20 witnesses. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and placed it across my lap. And I thought, good. Let them all see it, every single one. 2 words, calm, controlled, no emotion. Dwight's smile widened. He raised his glass slightly turned and walked back to the head of the table where Iris was already pulling out his chair. I walked to the side table by the kitchen door. Every guest in that room watched me cross the hardwood floor in silence. 20 pairs of eyes, 20 witnesses. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and placed it across my lap. 3 words. "Of course, son." That's all I said. Dwight smiled and walked back to his table. I sat down by the kitchen door and thought about the 40 years I'd spent teaching that boy that a real man stays calm under pressure. Apparently, he'd learned something. Now, 35 minutes later, I sat at that same side table watching Dwight stand beneath a photograph. He'd paid someone to erase me from telling 20 guests how he'd built a company with nothing but vision and hard work. He had cropped me out of our own photograph, not metaphorically, literally. The original was still in a frame in my kitchen in Brenham. I'd been standing 2 feet to his right, holding a spatula the day we opened. Now, I was just a missing edge. I sat at my side table by the kitchen door and watched my son erase me twice in one night, once from a photograph, once from a seat of honor, and I thought about the Navy folder resting in my leather bag under the table. And then my phone buzzed with a text from Opal Flynn, new fraud transaction, $47,000 authorized 20 minutes ago. $47,000 more dollars moved, while my son was getting his hair cut for the party, where he'd claim he built everything. I felt the phone buzz beneath the white napkin on my lap, subtle and insistent. I lifted the edge of the fabric and glanced down at the glowing screen. Opal Flynn. He authorized another transaction, $47,000, 20 minutes ago. Sent to DCR Consulting again. I've secured the wire confirmation printout. 20 minutes ago. 7:40 p.m. Right around the time Dwight was standing at the head of that table, smiling at the camera, preparing to tell everyone how he'd built this company with nothing but vision and hard work. My callous thumb moved steadily across the screen. I know. Thank you, Opal. 3 dots appeared immediately. Then, "Are you all right, Mr. Sutton?" I typed back, "I'm enjoying dinner." I slipped the phone into my pocket and looked up. At the main table, Dwight threw his head back, laughing uproariously at something Victor Greer had just said. He raised his glass in a toast champagne, catching the candlelight, his smile broad and confident. He'd stolen $47,000 20 minutes ago and was now toasting his own success. I caught Ryan's eye as he passed with a tray of empty appetizer plates. "Son," I said quietly, "could I get a glass of Pappy Van Winkle neat, please?" Ryan didn't hesitate, didn't check a price book, didn't ask if I was sure Pappy Van Winkle ran about $60 a pour at most places, over $100 at high-end establishments. He just nodded. "Right away, sir." The bourbon arrived in under 2 minutes, poured into an exquisite ultra-thin, Riedel crystal glass, the kind reserved for VIP tables, not side corners by kitchen doors. Ryan set it down on a fresh linen coaster with the careful precision of someone who'd been given very specific instructions about how to treat the man in the corner. Reed Nash had taken full control of my table service. The upgrade was beginning. I lifted the glass, swirled the amber liquid once, and took a slow sip. Smooth as silk. Warm, going down. The finest bourbon in Texas delivered to the table Dwight had exiled me to. 47,000 more. While he was getting his hair cut for this party, my son was moving $47,000 out of my company's account. I sipped the best bourbon in Texas and watched him toast his own success. 8:15 p.m., between the appetizer and the main course. I tracked the room with the precision of a man who'd spent 52 years reading kitchen dynamics, who worked the line, who called the shots, who was stealing prep time, who was cutting corners. You learned to see patterns, movements, the small tells that separated competence from chaos. That's when I noticed Nola Crane. She wasn't seated with the catering staff, wasn't positioned at a coordinator's desk near the door with a clipboard and a headset. She was sitting prominently in the middle of the main table, flanked by a senior Meridian executive on one side and an investor I didn't recognize on the other. And she wasn't wearing the Rose's premier catering staff uniform, the black slacks and white button-down, with the company logo embroidered on the chest. She was wearing an expensive black cocktail dress, hair styled, jewelry catching the light, seated like a guest, not an employee. Nola Crane was 29, a senior coordinator, who'd been with the company since 2018. I'd met her twice, once at a holiday party once when she'd stopped by the ranch to drop off paperwork Dwight had forgotten. Professional, efficient, smart. And now she was sitting at Dwight's gala table in evening wear, while the actual event staff worked the room in uniform. I watched her lift her water glass, not wine, I noted, and take a careful sip. Her eyes flicked toward the head of the table for just a fraction of a second. Dwight's eyes met hers. The glance lasted less than 1 second. Fleeting, tense, the kind of look you'd miss if you blinked. But I'd cooked in enough kitchens to know the difference between a coworker and a secret. That wasn't the glance of a CEO acknowledging his coordinator. That was the glance of two people harboring something dangerous. Something they both knew could detonate if anyone looked too closely. Dwight turned back to Victor immediately, his smile never faltering, his champagne glass raised in another toast. Nola looked down at her plate and didn't glance his direction again for the rest of the first course. I didn't know the full depth of what I was seeing. Not yet. But I knew an affair when I saw one. 52 years managing people under pressure teaches you to read a room faster than most people can read a menu. I'd spent 5 decades watching line cooks try to hide hangovers, sous chefs, try to hide relationships with front-of-house staff managers, try to hide skimming from the register. You learn the micro-expressions, the avoidance patterns, the way people who share a secret move through space differently than people who don't. Nola Crane was a secret, and from the way Dwight didn't look at her for the rest of the first course, she was a well-practiced one. I'd spent 52 years learning how to read a kitchen, how to see when a line cook was stealing, when a partner was skimming, when the numbers didn't balance. But I couldn't see my own son's hands in the register until it was already too late to stop him quietly. I set down my glass of Pappy Van Winkle and watched the main table through the amber light. Dwight was stealing during his own celebration. Nola Crane was sitting in an evening gown at a table where she should have been working. And Victor Greer was leaning close to my son, whispering something that made Dwight's smile falter for just a fraction of a second. I'd counted 3 secrets in 15 minutes. The question was how many more were waiting. And then Victor Greer stood up and walked directly toward me, carrying something in his hand that I recognized from 25 years ago. Some enemies introduce themselves at the exact moment they think you're weakest. Victor Greer stood from the main table and walked across the dining room with the confident stride of a man who owned things. Not hurried, not casual, deliberate. He moved past the bar, past the servers, arranging dessert trays, straight toward the secluded corner where my side table sat by the kitchen door. He positioned himself carefully back to the room, ensuring no one was within earshot. Then he extended his hand. "Arthur Sutton." He said, his grip firm, controlled. "I've been meaning to have a real word with you." I stood and shook his hand. "We spoke in 2019, Mr. Greer. We exchanged pleasantries." Victor corrected, his smile tight. "This is different." He released my hand and reached into his jacket pocket. When his fingers emerged, they held a faded laminated business card yellowed with age, the edges worn smooth from years of handling. He placed it flat on my table. Greer Hospitality Group. The old logo, circa 2000. Before the rebrands, before the expansions. The original design from when Victor was still building his Empire Hotel by Hotel across Texas. I'd seen that card before, 25 years ago, in a different restaurant. When Victor had made me an offer, I'd turned down without hesitation. "I made you a substantial offer 25 years ago for your San Antonio properties," Victor said quietly, watching my face. "You turned me down. Smart move back then. Sutton's Smokehouse went on to become legendary." I looked at the card, then back at him. "What do you want tonight, Victor?" His smile disappeared. "The same thing I wanted in 2000, he said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "The brand, the proprietary spice recipes, the name." He leaned closer, close enough that I could smell the expensive cologne, see the calculation in his eyes. "I made you a substantial offer 25 years ago," Victor said quietly. "You turned me down. I respected that. But a man like me doesn't stop wanting what he can't have. He just finds a different door." He let that hang in the air. Didn't need to say more. The old yellow business card on my table said everything. 25 years of patience finally cashing out through my own son's ambition. "I hope you enjoy tonight, Arthur," he said. "You've built something remarkable." He turned and walked back to the head table. I sat there for a moment, turning the yellow card over in my fingers. He hadn't confirmed anything, hadn't admitted anything. He didn't need to. I already had everything I needed in the Navy folder under my feet, and Estelle's documents would reach the Meridian Group before Victor's takeover contracts could be filed. 25 years. He'd come so close. He had no idea the door he'd been trying to open for a quarter century was already being welded shut from the inside. If the takeover gets messy, we've already extracted the valuable assets. So, that was the third secret. Iris wasn't just Dwight's wife. She was Victor's operative. And when you take control, I said, what happens to Dwight? Victor's smile widened. Dwight gets exactly what he deserves. A title with no power. A salary with no equity. He'll spend the rest of his career working for me, managing a brand I'll rebrand under Greer Hospitality, wondering how he lost everything he thought he'd built. He paused, letting that sink in. Just like you, Arthur, except you saw it coming. Your son won't. I reached down and picked up the yellowed business card from my table, slipped it into my pocket with the same calm precision I'd used for 52 years. I'll take that under advisement, I said. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, trying to read whether I understood the threat, whether I was capitulating or planning. I didn't give him anything to read. I just turned and walked back toward my side table without another word, leaving Victor Greer standing alone in the secluded corner, his vendetta delivered, his trap revealed. 25 years. Victor Greer had been waiting 25 years to own what I'd built, and he'd use my son to get a seat at my table. I walked back to the kitchen door and sat down. I had more enemies in this room than I'd counted. Dwight stealing from the inside, Victor circling from the outside, Iris selling the database to competitors. Good. It meant the win would be worth more, and every single piece was already in place. I reached into my vest pocket, felt the outline of the velvet box, Rose's watch. The navy folder rested in my bag beneath the table, Estelle's removal documents. The operating agreement showing Dwight owned 0% equity, meaning Victor's takeover contracts were worthless the moment I filed. Victor thought he was taking control from Dwight. He had no idea Dwight had never had control to give. I looked up from my side table and realized something had changed. The cheap glassware was gone, replaced by crystal that caught the candlelight like liquid gold. When I came back from the restroom, my table had been replaced. Not moved, not rearranged, replaced. The standard white cotton tablecloth was gone. In its place, Egyptian cotton and deep ivory, the kind of linen you only saw at five-star establishments, heavy and textured under my fingertips. The cheap stainless steel flatware had vanished. Christofle Montmaison, sterling silver, rested on either side of the plate. I recognized the pattern instantly from the high-end restaurant supply catalogs I'd studied for 40 years. The weight of it in my hand was substantial perfect. The thin bulk order water glass had been replaced with a Riedel Sommelier Burgundy Grand Cru ultra-thin crystal that caught the candlelight and threw it back in fractured gold. The crystal silver caught the light like accusations. And at the center of the transformed table, resting on pristine white porcelain, sat a dish I hadn't seen in 15 years. Smoked brisket tartare, hand-cut Texas beef cured for 24 hours in my proprietary spice blend. A perfectly poached quail egg resting in the center yolk, still liquid. Jalapeno oil drizzled in a precise spiral. Citrus smoke aroma rising with the heat. Toasted brioche points arranged like a crown. The exact dish that had won me the Texas Monthly cover in 1989. I stood there for 3 full seconds staring at that plate. Reed Nash appeared at the edge of my peripheral vision, standing near the kitchen pass in spotless white chef's coat, arms crossed, watching me with the stillness of someone waiting for recognition. Our eyes met across the dining room. He nodded once. Sharp, deliberate. I understood immediately. Reed hadn't just upgraded my service. He'd personally cooked my signature dish, the one that had made Sutton Smokehouse legendary, the one food critics had driven 3 hours to taste, the one that had put my name on the culinary map before Dwight was born. Reed Nash, Dwight's hand-picked executive chef, had just created a silent counter-narrative to the erasure happening 15 feet away at the main table. I picked up the Christofle fork cut into the tartare, placed a small portion on the brioche. The jalapeno oil's citrus smoke aroma hit first, then the cure perfectly balanced the spice blend I'd spent a decade perfecting. The brioche was still warm from the oven. It tasted exactly like 1989. I looked back toward the kitchen pass. Reed was gone, already back to running his line, but the message had been delivered. Even Dwight's own people knew who had really built this. At the main table, Dwight stood again, tapping his crystal glass with his knife. The room quieted. Behind him, the LED screen powered up with a new slide. Revenue growth, a 3-year transformation. The chart showed 2 bars, $2,000 to $2,900,000, 2023 3.0, $6 million, 340% growth. Dwight announced, his voice carrying across the room with practiced confidence. This didn't happen by accident. It took vision, discipline, and frankly a willingness to make hard calls. Applause from the investors. Victor Greer nodded approvingly. Iris beamed. I took another bite of the tartara and watched my son claim credit for growth he'd funded with money I'd borrowed against my own life. Streamlined operations. Dwight continued, clicking to the next slide. Modernized procurement systems. Strategic vendor relationships. These weren't just improvements, they were fundamental reimagining of how a catering company operates in the modern market. More applause. I set down my fork and picked up the Riedel Crystal, swirled the Pappy Van Winkle Reed had sent over earlier. The bourbon caught the light the same way the silver had. Now I want to be clear, Dwight said, his tone shifting slightly softer, almost magnanimous. I didn't do this alone. The room leaned forward slightly. This was the moment, the acknowledgement, the place where a son was supposed to honor his father. My father helped out around the edges, Dwight said smoothly. Minor support during the transition. But this, he gestured to the growth chart. This was about execution, about having the courage to move beyond legacy thinking and build something modern. Helped out. 2 words. 33 years. I looked across the room at Elena Patterson, a senior investor from Dallas, who'd put $200,000 into the expansion, her face tightened, eyes flicking toward me briefly before returning to Dwight. She'd seen the operating agreement. She knew who owned the company. She knew exactly what helped out around the edges really meant. Minor support, Dwight repeated as if the phrase needed emphasis. What you're seeing here is the result of strategic vision, of understanding that sometimes you have to let go of the old ways to build something sustainable. I picked up the Christoffel knife, cut another piece of brioche, layered it carefully with tartare and a sliver of quail egg. Helped out. Like I'd swept floors while he built an empire. Like 44 years of smoke and grease and burned hands and early mornings and Rose handing me coffee at midnight had been around the edges. Like borrowing against my life insurance policy to give him startup capital had been minor support. I'd funded every dollar of that growth chart, designed the kitchen he was standing in, written the first check, signed the operating agreement that gave him operational control while I maintained full equity protection I'd insisted on, that Rose had insisted on, that Estelle had insisted on. And he just reduced it all to 2 words in front of 20 witnesses. Helped out. I filed the phrase away in the same mental drawer where I'd been collecting evidence for 6 months, next to the photoshopped photograph, next to the $340,000 in wire fraud, next to the seat of honor he'd given to Victor Greer instead of his own father. The drawer was getting full. I took another bite of Reed's perfect tartara and watched Dwight accept another round of applause for growth he'd achieved with money I'd given him and recipes I'd created and a reputation I'd spent 44 years building. I was about to take another bite when Bobby Sutton walked through the front door, 6 hours late, shirt untucked and grinning like he'd just won something. The heavy oak doors swung open and every head in the room turned. Bobby Sutton. My younger son walked through the entrance wearing a crisp navy suit and hand-tooled Texas boots. 34 years old, broad-shouldered like his mother's side of the family jaw, set with the kind of determination I'd taught both my boys when they were young enough to listen. No invitation in his hand, no name tag on his chest, no apology in his posture. He stopped just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the candlelight, scanning the main table with the methodical precision of a man who'd built things for a living. Civil engineer, Austin. Good job, good head on his shoulders. We'd spoken 3 days ago when I'd called him from my back porch and asked him to be here. His eyes found mine across the dining room. I nodded once. He walked straight toward me, not to the main table where Dwight sat frozen champagne flute halfway to his lips, not to the bar, not to greet the investors he'd never met. Just a straight line across the hardwood floor, boots clicking with each step, 20 pairs of eyes tracking his movement. Someone at the main table whispered, "Who's that?" Bobby crossed the room like he owned it. And in a way he did because I did, and he was the only son who'd shown up when I'd asked. Dwight's face had gone pale. Iris grabbed his sleeve, leaning close, her voice urgent enough to carry across the room. "Is that your brother? Why is he here?" Bobby reached my side table and pulled out the empty chair across from me. He sat down, stretched his legs under the table, and looked at me with the first genuine smile I'd seen from either of my sons in 3 years. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Sorry I'm late, took longer than I thought." I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief, not vindication. Just the simple, clean feeling of not being alone anymore. "I'm glad you made the drive, son," I said. 2 words, 1 chair. Everything changed. The geometry of the room transformed in an instant. I wasn't the isolated old man exiled to the kitchen door anymore. I was a father with a son who'd driven 4 hours because I'd asked him to. A father with family backup. A father with witnesses who cared. Across the dining room, Dwight set down his champagne flute with a hand that wasn't quite steady. He stood smoothing his jacket, his corporate smile slipping back into place like armor. "Bobby," he said, voice tight, projecting across the room. "This is a private investor event." Bobby didn't even look at him. Just picked up the menu card Reed had left on my table, studied it like he had all the time in the world. "Looks like a family dinner to me," Bobby said casually. "Dad's here, I'm here, you're here. That's family, right?" Victor Greer's eyes narrowed, watching this exchange with the sharp attention of a man recalculating odds. Elena Patterson pulled out her phone, typing something quickly under the table. Ryan appeared with a second glass of Pappy Van Winkle, setting it down in front of Bobby without being asked. Reed's work again. The upgrade was complete, both of us sitting at the transformed table with museum-quality everything, while Dwight stood at the main table, trying to figure out how his carefully controlled narrative had just collapsed. Before I tell you what Iris whispered to Dwight next, comment: A, if you think Dwight hiding his brother was deliberate erasure, or B, if it's just family drama, and add Y in 5 to 10 words. Please note some details ahead are dramatized for emotional impact, because this is where Dwight's carefully constructed image starts to fracture beyond repair. Iris's grip on Dwight's sleeve tightened. Her eyes darted between her husband and the brother he'd never mentioned. The brother who wasn't in any family photos displayed at their wedding. The brother whose name had never come up in 3 years of marriage. "Why didn't you tell me you had a brother?" Iris hissed, quiet enough that only the people closest to them could hear. But in a silent room, quiet carries. Dwight's speech notes sat abandoned on the lectern. His PowerPoint presentation was still frozen on the slide about his strategic vision. His investors were watching his younger brother sit down at their father's table, like he belonged there. Bobby leaned back in his chair, completely comfortable, making it abundantly clear he had no intention of leaving. He picked up his bourbon, swirled it once, took a slow sip. "So what did I miss?" he asked me, his voice carrying. I almost smiled. "Your brother was just explaining how he built everything from nothing." Bobby's eyebrows went up slightly. "From nothing. That's interesting. I remember you taking out a pretty substantial loan to fund his startup." $3 million, I said evenly, "against my life insurance policy." "Right," Bobby said, nodding. $3 million, that's not exactly nothing. Every investor at that table heard it. Every single one. Victor Greer leaned toward Nola Crane, eyebrows raised, recalculating something. Elena Patterson's phone screen glowed under the table as she typed furiously. The Meridian executives exchanged glances, and Iris stared at her husband with the particular expression of someone realizing they'd married a man they didn't actually know. How do you explain a brother you've spent 3 years pretending doesn't exist? Dwight had erased me from photographs, from his origin story from the seat of honor at his own celebration. But he'd also erased Bobby, his own brother, his own blood, the other half of the family that had built him. And now Bobby was sitting 15 feet away drinking $60 bourbon, asking questions Dwight didn't want answered. I watched my older son stand at the head of that table, surrounded by investors and venture capital and his father-in-law's money, and realized that the brother he'd pretended didn't exist had just walked into his carefully controlled narrative and blown it apart. Victor Greer leaned toward Nola Crane, eyebrows raised. Elena Patterson set down her wine glass and pulled out her phone. Bobby stretched his legs under the table like he owned the place because his father did. Bobby pushed back from the table and headed toward the bar for water. I watched him cross the room with that easy stride Rose used to have, confident but not showy. The kind of walk that said, you belong somewhere because you'd earned it, not because you'd stolen it. Dwight was still holding court near the photoshopped founding photo, gesturing at Elena and 2 investors like he was explaining the secrets of the universe. Iris stood just outside their circle, phone pressed to her ear, turned toward the hallway that led to the restrooms. Bobby slowed near the beverage station. Not stopped, just slowed. His hand went to his pocket. I couldn't see his face from where I sat, but I knew that posture. He was listening. Iris's voice carried better than she probably thought it did. The anniversary party noise had shifted. People were eating now, conversation dropping to that comfortable dinner hum. Her words cut through it like smoke rising off a grill. 412 premium accounts, she said. Complete contact information, renewal dates, average spend per event. Everything you need? I felt my hand tighten around Earl's knife in my pocket. Bobby's shoulders went still. His phone came out casual like he was checking a text, but the way he angled it toward Iris told a different story. The transfer goes through Monday. Iris continued. Her back was still to the room, still to Bobby. Dwight doesn't need to know. By the time anyone realizes the client list has been duplicated, you'll already have 3 months of outreach completed. She laughed. Actually laughed. The old man won't know until it's gone. He's barely here anymore anyway. Bobby stood there for another 30 seconds, phone steady, face empty. When Iris finally turned back toward the party, he was already at the bar filling a glass with ice water, scrolling through his phone like he'd been doing it the whole time. He walked back to our table, sat down, took a long drink. Got it, he said quietly. 2 words, but I heard 44 years of barbecue smoke and betrayal in them. 90 seconds, 412 accounts, 1 recording. I reached into my jacket pocket, not for the knife this time, for the navy velvet box I'd been carrying since Thursday morning. Bobby's eyes dropped to it. He didn't ask what it was, didn't need to. I opened the lid. Rose's anniversary watch caught the light platinum case sapphire markers, that inscription on the back, that still made my chest tight after all these years. A&R Forever, 1982. The year we opened the first location, the year Dwight was born, the year I promised her I'd build something that mattered. Your mother wore this every day for 23 years, I said. Even in the kitchen, even when I told her it was too nice for work. Bobby stared at it like he was looking at Rose herself. She left instructions, I continued. In the letter from the safety deposit box, said I'd know when it was time. Across the room, Dwight was laughing at something Victor had said. That performance laugh he'd learned somewhere between business school and becoming someone I didn't recognize. Iris had returned to his side phone, tucked away smiling, like she hadn't just sold our client list to a competitor. Eleanor glided past our table with a tray of desserts, not looking at me, not looking at the watch, not looking at 44 years of my life reduced to a side table near the kitchen. Mom wanted Dwight to have it, Bobby said. Not a question, a statement. I nodded. She did, wrote it in the letter. Give this to our son when he's ready to carry what we built. I let that sentence sit between us for a moment. Let Bobby hear what Rose had actually written, what she'd actually meant. Ready to carry what we built. Not ready to erase it, not ready to profit from it, not ready to steal it, ready to carry it. Bobby's jaw tightened. He understood. I closed the lid. The soft click sounded like a vault door shutting. But he's not ready, I said. The box went back into my pocket, not to the table, not to Dwight's hands, not to the son Rose had loved enough to name a company after her own mother. Back into my pocket, back into the dark, back into waiting for someone who might never exist. Bobby didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The recording on his phone said everything that mattered. 90 seconds of Iris selling 412 accounts. 90 seconds of my son's company rotting from the inside while he smiled for investors and erased me from photographs. The velvet box disappeared like a door closing in slow motion. I thought about Rose's letter again. That part near the end I'd read so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. If Dwight isn't the man we hoped he'd be, don't force it. Some inheritances destroy the people who receive them. Better to let it go than watch it poison someone you love. She'd known. Somehow, back in 2017, when she wrote those words, she'd already seen what I was still pretending not to notice. That our son had stopped being ours somewhere along the way. That he'd become something else. Someone else. Victor caught my eye from across the room, raised his wine glass half an inch, that same thin smile from the Mortons' dinner 4 years ago. You don't have a son, his expression said. You have a successor. I thought he was wrong then. My hand slipped out of my pocket empty. Bobby glanced at the recording timestamp on his phone, 1:32. Across the room, Iris returned to Dwight's side, smiling like nothing had happened. Nola Crane stood up from the main table, ignoring Dwight's stare. I watched her push her chair back with the careful precision of someone who'd made an irrevocable decision. The recording on Bobby's phone was still warm. Iris selling 412 accounts while smiling like a hostess. Now, Nola was crossing the hardwood floor toward our side table, each step measured, hands trembling slightly at her sides. Dwight's expression shifted from confusion to warning, that cold look he gave employees when they stepped out of line. Nola didn't turn around. She reached our table and stood there for 3 seconds, not asking permission, just gathering whatever courage she had left. Then she sat down directly across from me. Bobby shifted his water glass, giving her space. "Mr. Sutton," Nola said quietly, "I need to tell you the truth about the Meridian contract." Her voice had that rehearsed steadiness people use when they know they're burning everything behind them. I waited. "Dwight forged your signature," she continued, "on the acquisition agreement, the one that transferred operational control to the Meridian Group." I felt Earl's knife press against my ribs through my jacket pocket. 44 years of building something real, and my son had forged my name to sell it. "I watched him practice," Nola said, "for 2 weeks, at his desk after hours. He had samples of your signature from old contracts, the way you loop the A, the slant on Sutton. He'd trace them over and over until his hand remembered the movement." She pulled her phone from her clutch. Her hands were shaking harder now. "I took forensic photos, encrypted email backups, practice sheets with 30 versions of your signature on each page, the original Meridian contract with the forged signature, everything." She slid the phone across the table. The screen showed a PDF timestamp, October 14th, 2023, 3.5 weeks ago. The day before, Reed Nash told me the Meridian deal was already done. Bobby leaned in slightly enough to see the image. Dwight's handwriting practicing Arthur Sutton in rows like a school kid learning cursive. Except he was learning how to steal a company. "Why now?" I asked. Nola's jaw tightened. When she looked up, her eyes had that hollow brightness that comes right before tears. "He's firing me Monday," she said. "Iris told him I know too much, about the offshore account, about the client database sale, about—" She stopped, swallowed. "About everything." Across the room, Dwight was still watching her. Victor stood at his shoulder whispering something that made my son's expression go flat. "There's one more thing," Nola said. "I'm 9 weeks pregnant. It's his." 9 weeks, 2 signatures, 1 firing notice. I looked at the woman sitting across from me, 32 years old, office manager, pregnant with my grandchild, about to lose everything because she'd seen too much and stayed quiet too long. "Bobby," I said quietly, "make sure Ms. Crane gets home safely tonight, then forward her evidence to the attorney listed in the Navy folder." Bobby nodded. Nola stood up slowly like she was testing whether her legs would hold. "Thank you," she whispered. She walked toward the exit, not back to Dwight's table, not back to anything, just out. I waited until she was gone, then stood and headed for the south doors. The parking lot air hit cold against my face, 62 degrees dry, November in Texas. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the contact I'd saved 3 days ago, Estelle Lang. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Sutton." Her voice had that calm precision I remembered from our first meeting 6 months ago, when Reed Nash handed me the Navy folder. Estelle Lang, 52 civil litigation attorney at Lang & Associates, known for methodical case building and quiet devastation in depositions. The kind of lawyer who never raised her voice because she never needed to. "Estelle," I said, "we have signature forgery on the Meridian contract, forensic documentation, witness testimony, practice sheets. Silence on the line, not shock calculation. That shifts the case to criminal felony referral territory," she said. "Wire fraud, contract forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, federal exposure across the board. I'll file the civil removal motion first thing Monday and refer the criminal evidence to the U.S. Attorney's Office." Or there's more, I continued. "Client database theft, scheduled for Monday morning. 90 seconds of recorded evidence." "I'd send it encrypted," Estelle said. "I'll loop in—" She stopped mid-sentence. I heard a car door close on her end of the line. "Mr. Sutton," she said slowly. "I'm in my car outside Lang & Associates. FBI Special Agent Vera Ashford from Financial Crimes Division just pulled up next to me. She's holding what looks like a federal search warrant." My hand tightened on the phone. "For what?" "Rose's premier catering company servers. She says they've been monitoring your son for 4 months. Independent investigation. Bank fraud, wire fraud, fraudulent contracts. The federal case and our civil case just collided." I heard Estelle's car window roll down. muffled voices. A woman's voice saying, "Financial Crimes Division," and "Sealed warrant." "Estelle," I said. "Tell Agent Ashford the subject of her warrant is currently hosting his company anniversary party at the Ember Room on Hancock Street, south entrance. Tell her to arrive in 20 minutes. The dessert course will be ending, and all primary witnesses will still be on site." Another pause, longer this time. "Understood," Estelle said. "Mr. Sutton, this is comprehensive federal exposure. If they've been watching for 4 months, they have everything." "Good," I said. I ended the call and stood there in the parking lot, phone in hand, looking back through the glass doors. Inside, Dwight stood at the lectern again, gesturing at a slide projection I couldn't see from here. Victor and Elena flanked him like bookends. Iris smiled at an investor. The photoshopped founding photo hung on the wall, erasing me from my own history. How long had the walls been closing in, without Dwight even knowing? 4 months of FBI surveillance, 6 months of Reed Nash building the civil case, 2 weeks of signature practice that Nola documented, $47,000 in new fraud that Opal caught, 412 accounts that Iris sold while Bobby recorded, 1 navy velvet box that stayed in my pocket instead of passing to my son's hands. Every angle aligned, legal federal witnesses' evidence, all of it converging on the same night, in the same room, at the same moment. I pocketed my phone and looked back through the glass doors. Dwight was still at the lectern, projecting confidence. He had no idea the FBI was 20 minutes away, or that his mistress had just handed his father a felony. The south doors swung open at 10:05 p.m. sharp. I was still standing in the parking lot, phone in my pocket, watching through the glass as Dwight gestured at his investors. 20 minutes had passed since Estelle confirmed the FBI warrant. 20 minutes of Dwight projecting confidence he no longer owned. Estelle Lang stepped into the light. Charcoal suit perfectly tailored, reading glasses on a silver chain, and in her hands the navy leather folder Reed Nash had given me 6 months ago, thicker now, reinforced at the spine, heavy with documentation. She didn't hurry, didn't scan the room looking for me. She simply stood there in the doorway, backlit by the hallway sconces, letting the entire room register the uninvited legal force that had just entered their celebration. 5 seconds of absolute silence. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. The slideshow projector kept cycling through images of Dwight's manufactured legacy, but no one was watching anymore. Dwight caught sight of her from the lectern. All the color drained from his face, that sick gray that comes when you suddenly realize the trap has already closed. Iris leaned toward him, urgent whisper cutting through the quiet. "Who is that woman?" Dwight's voice came out barely audible. "That's his attorney." Estelle walked past the head table without a glance, past Victor, who'd gone very still, past Elena and the investors who'd flown in from California to celebrate a company they thought Dwight had built alone, past the 8-foot banner and the photoshopped founding photo, and 44 years of my history erased. She stopped at our side table, looked at Bobby, who shifted his chair to make space. Then she sat down beside me and placed the navy folder flat on the white linen directly in the center where everyone could see it. "Mr. Sutton," she said quietly, "everything is ready." I nodded. The room stayed frozen. 60 people watching a woman in a charcoal suit sit at a side table near the kitchen. And somehow that simple action had transformed the entire geometry of power in the room. I wasn't the dismissed founder anymore. Wasn't the man whose name had been practiced on signature sheets for 2 weeks. Wasn't the father whose son had forged documents and stolen a company. I was the plaintiff, armed, documented, ready. Estelle opened the folder. I caught a glimpse of the top-page forensic accounting report, Opal's signature at the bottom, $340,000, highlighted in yellow. Underneath that, more pages, contracts, bank statements, email printouts, the photographic evidence Nola had provided 90 minutes ago, Bobby's recording of Iris selling 412 accounts, 6 months of Reed Nash's methodical case building, all of it organized in chronological tabs with color-coded evidence markers. 5 seconds, 1 folder, total silence. Then the main doors, not the south entrance Estelle had used, but the wide double doors at the front of the room, swung open hard enough to hit the wall stops. Special Agent Vera Ashford walked in like she owned the building. 46 years old, dark suit, FBI financial crimes badge clipped to her belt where everyone could see it. Behind her, a younger field agent male, armed hand resting casually near his service weapon. Not threatening, just present. Vera carried a slim black portfolio. She crossed the room with the same unhurried certainty Estelle had used, except her path led straight to our table. She stopped, made brief eye contact with Estelle, then handed her the portfolio. "Ms. Lang," Vera said, "federal search warrant for Rose's premier catering company, servers, financial records, and communication devices. Executed as of 10:08 p.m. Estelle accepted it with a nod. "Thank you, Agent Ashford." Then Vera turned to me. "Mr. Sutton," she said, voice carrying across the silent room. "The Bureau appreciates your cooperation over the last 6 months. Your documentation has been instrumental." 6 months. I heard Iris's sharp intake of breath from the head table, heard Victor's wine glass hit the tablecloth, heard the exact moment Dwight understood that every move he'd made since May, every forged signature, every offshore transfer, every lie to investors had been recorded and reported to federal investigators. Dwight's voice came out strangled. "What is this?" Vera didn't look at him yet. She was still addressing me, establishing the hierarchy for everyone watching. "The forensic accountant you recommended was particularly helpful," she continued. "Ms. Opal's testimony regarding the systematic fund diversion will be central to the wire fraud charges." Only then did she turn to face my son. "Mr. Dwight Sutton." Vera said formal and final. "You are under active federal investigation for wire fraud, tax evasion, and contract forgery. Additional charges may be forthcoming, pending analysis of the server data. You are ordered not to leave this venue. Agents will be stationed at all exits. Do you understand?" Dwight just stared at her. His mouth closed, opened again. No sound came out. Iris grabbed his arm. "Dwight, say something. Tell them..." "Tell them what?" Vera asked mildly. "That he didn't forge his father's signature on the Meridian acquisition agreement. We have forensic documentation and witness testimony. That he didn't divert company funds to offshore accounts. We have 6 months of bank records. That he didn't instruct his wife to sell proprietary client data to competitors. We have audio recordings." She paused. "Mr. Sutton, if you wish to make a statement, I recommend you wait for legal counsel. Anything you say right now will be documented and submitted as evidence." The field agent behind her shifted position, slightly blocking the main exit. How do you run when the FBI is standing at the only exit? Dwight's eyes swept the room past the investors, past Victor, past Eleanor, who'd helped erase me from photographs, past the banner proclaiming 44 years of vision and growth. Then his gaze landed on me. I sat at the side table near the kitchen, flanked by a federal agent and a civil attorney with a Navy folder full of evidence. Bobby beside me, phone in his pocket with 90 seconds of recorded felony. Earl's knife and Rose's watch in my jacket, both of them staying right where they belonged. The investors sat frozen. Victor's face had gone white. Dwight turned to his father, the father he'd erased, the father he'd dismissed as minor support, and for the first time in 3 years, he saw someone he didn't recognize. The kitchen partition swung wide. Dwight was still staring at me, at the man sitting beside FBI agents and attorneys, surrounded by evidence he'd thought was safely hidden. The room held its breath. Reed Nash walked out. White dress shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. Chef's build still solid at 63. He crossed the hardwood floor with the same quiet authority he'd carried since I'd taught him to break down his first brisket 44 years ago. His path took him past the investors, past the head table, past Dwight, who'd claimed sole credit for building Rose's premier catering. Reed stopped 3 feet from where I sat. Then he bowed his head. "Chef Arthur," he said. 2 words, but they carried across the silent room like a bell. Dwight's face went rigid. Reed straightened, turned to address the room. His voice had that carry you develop in professional kitchens, not shouting, just projecting with absolute clarity. "This man taught me to break down my first brisket when I was 19 years old," Reed said. "Taught me the difference between cooking and craft. When I wanted to open my first restaurant in 1989, and no bank would look at me, he wrote me a $50,000 personal check. No contract, no interest, just pay me back when you can." He gestured toward the tables where the investors had been eating. "Everything you ate tonight started in his kitchen, the dry rub formula, the smoking temperature curves, the sauce ratios, 44 years of technique that built Rose's premier catering from a single food truck into a $3 million operation." Reed turned back to the head table. Victor sat, frozen wine glass still on the tablecloth where he'd set it down hard. Eleanor Greer, Victor's wife, silent partner in Greer Hospitality Group. Hermès scarf, perfectly arranged, despite the chaos, watched with controlled composure, that didn't quite hide the calculation happening behind her eyes. "Your table is ready, chef," Reed said to me. He walked to the head table and pulled out Victor's chair. The room stayed silent. 60 people watching a chef offer the seat of honor to the man who'd been relegated to a side table near the kitchen. The man whose company anniversary party had erased him from every photograph and banner. I stood. Bobby rose with me. Estelle gathered the navy folder. We crossed the floor together. I didn't hurry, didn't make a show of it. Just walked to the table that should have been mine from the beginning and sat down in the chair Reed held. Victor stood and moved 3 seats down without a word. Eleanor followed. Dwight remained at the lectern hands, gripping the edges like he needed them to stay upright. Estelle placed the navy folder in front of me, opened it to a specific tab, red marker legal-size pages, notarized seal visible at the bottom. I pulled out the document and held it up so the entire room could see the letterhead. Operating agreement. I said. My voice came out steady, calm. 44 years of quiet fury distilled into absolute control. Rose's Premier Catering LLC, filed with the state of Texas, November 2016, Austin. I turned to the first interior page. Article 3, Membership Interest and Capital Contributions. I read it word for word. Arthur James Sutton, 100% absolute equity, 100% voting control, 100% the distribution rights. I paused. Let that settle. Dwight R. Sutton, Managing Operator. 0% equity, 0% ownership. 0% claim to company assets or intellectual property. 100%, 0%, 9 signatures. Iris made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. Dwight's knuckles had gone white on the lectern. Article 7. I continued. Removal and termination. The sole member, that's me, may remove the managing operator immediately, and without cause for gross negligence, fraud, forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, or any action that damages the company's reputation or financial standing. I set the operating agreement on the table and pulled out the next document. Annual Compliance Acknowledgement, I said. Signed by Dwight R. Sutton, November 2016. I placed it face up on the white linen. November 2017. Another page. November 2018. November 2019. November 2020. November 2021. November 2022. Each acknowledgement went down like a card in a hand of poker I'd been holding for 7 years. And November 2023, 2 weeks ago, 9 times total. I looked at my son. You signed this operating agreement in 2016. You signed compliance acknowledgement every single year for 7 years after that. 9 times you put your signature on a document that stated in explicit legal language that you owned 0% of this company. 9 times you confirmed you understood the terms. 9 times you acknowledged that fraud or forgery would result in immediate removal. Dwight's mouth opened. No sound came out. The Meridian contract, I said. Forged signature. The offshore accounts funds diverted from company operations you had no ownership stake in. The client database your wife is selling proprietary assets that were never yours to authorize. Estelle pulled out another document, slid it across the table to where the California investors could see. Forensic accounting report, she said quietly. $340,000 in fraudulent transfers. Documented, time-stamped, irrefutable. Hey, Dad, Dwight's voice cracked. Please, I can explain. You signed it, son, I said. 9 times. You knew every term. You knew you owned nothing. You lied to investors. You lied to vendors. You lied to the people who trusted you to run a company you were stealing. I built this. You built nothing. My voice stayed level. You operated what I built, and you destroyed it while pretending it was yours. How do you beg for mercy when you signed away your defense 9 times? Dwight's face collapsed. Not anger anymore. Not defiance. Just blank realization that every witness in the room, the investors who'd flown in from California, the vendors who'd supplied events, the employees who'd believed his story, now knew he'd lied about owning his father's company. Victor Greer pushed back from the table without a word. Victor stood to quietly exit. Eleanor rose with him. The investors were already calculating their own departures, 60 people who'd flown in to celebrate a company they now knew was built on lies. Dwight remained at the lectern, gripping it like a drowning man holding driftwood. Victor. My voice cut through the room like a gunshot. Victor froze mid-step. didn't turn around. Just stopped back, rigid hand still on Eleanor's elbow. I reached into my jacket pocket, not for Earl's knife this time, not for Rose's watch, for the bright yellow business card Victor had handed me 3 hours ago with that thin smile and those 2 words, "Call me." I held it up so the room could see the garish color. "Greer Hospitality Group," I said. "Victor gave me this tonight. Thought it was the first time he'd ever offered to buy what I built." I set the yellow card on the white linen. Then I reached into the navy folder and pulled out a document that had been sitting in my safety deposit box for 23 years, faded, folded in thirds, the paper gone soft at the creases. Official letter of intent. I continued. Greer Hospitality Group, dated March 12, 2000. Victor turned around slowly. His face had gone the color of ash. "It's $400,000, I read, "for acquisition of proprietary recipes, smoking techniques, sauce formulations, brand trademarks, and client relationships associated with Rose's premier catering." I looked up at him. "You've been trying to buy my blood for 25 years, Victor. I told you no in 2000. You came back in 2005. I told you no again. You tried in 2010, 2015, 2019. Every time the answer was the same." Eleanor's hand slipped from Victor's arm. "So you changed tactics," I said. "You couldn't buy the recipes, so you decided to access them through family. Your daughter married my son in 2018. Convenient timing. 2 months after my wife died. 2 months after I was too grief-broken to notice the strategy shift." Iris's face had gone white. "You used my son as a Trojan horse." I continued, voice still level. "Thought he held the keys to my vault. Thought if you got close enough, patient enough, you could finally get what you'd been chasing since the first time you tasted my brisket at the state fair in 1999. Victor's jaw worked. No words came out. "But he didn't have the keys, Victor. He never did. The recipes stay in my head. The techniques stay in my hands. The formulas died with Rose because I never wrote them down, where someone like you could steal them." I folded the letter of intent and set it beside the yellow card. "Sit down," I said quietly, "or walk out empty-handed after 25 years of failure. 25 years, $400,000, 1 Trojan horse." Victor sank back into his chair. Not because I'd ordered it, because every executive and investor in the room had turned their backs to him, because his quarter-century pursuit of my recipes had just been exposed as corporate espionage dressed up as family alliance, because he'd lost. Eleanor sat beside him, her mess scarf, perfectly arranged eyes empty. Bobby stood from his seat, pulled his phone from his pocket, walked to the media station where the slideshow projector was still cycling through images of Dwight's manufactured empire. He disconnected the HDMI cable, plugged in his phone instead, placed it carefully under the microphone Eleanor had set up for Dwight's anniversary speech. The room's speaker system hummed to life. Bobby's finger hovered over the screen for just a moment. Then he pressed play. Iris's voice filled the room. "Proprietary database, 412 premium accounts. Complete contact information renewal, dates average spend per event. Everything you need." The voice on the other end was male professional unfamiliar. "And the transfer timeline. Monday morning," Iris said. Her recorded voice had that casual confidence of someone who thought they were safe. "The old man won't know until it's gone. He's barely here anymore anyway. Dwight doesn't need to know either. He's too focused on the investors to notice one database export." Laughter. Actual laughter. "By the time anyone realizes the client list has been duplicated, you'll already have 3 months of outreach completed. 90 seconds of recorded felony played through speakers meant for anniversary toasts. Every word crystal clear, every betrayal documented." Dwight's face went from white to purple. "What the hell is that?" He lunged toward Bobby, who calmly pocketed his phone and stepped back. Iris stood so fast her chair tipped over. "It was for us, for the company." "For us," Dwight's voice cracked. "You were selling our client list?" "Your client list?" I said quietly. "You own 0%. Remember, those 412 accounts belong to me. She was selling my assets." Victor was staring at his daughter, not with shock, not with betrayal, with the dead-eyed calculation of a corporate executive watching an asset get liquidated at a loss. She'd failed. Worse, she'd gotten caught. In Victor's world, that was the only sin that mattered. Agent Ashford stepped forward. She'd been standing near the wall watching everything unfold with the patience of someone who'd seen 1,000 similar scenes. Now her hand moved to her belt, not to her weapon, to the steel handcuffs clipped beside her badge. Ms. Iris Greer Sutton, she said. Her voice carried the same formal weight it had when she'd announced Dwight's investigation. You are under active federal investigation for criminal misappropriation of trade secrets wire fraud in the sale of proprietary business assets and conspiracy to commit theft of intellectual property. The cuffs came out. Standard issue steel polished to a mirror shine under the chandelier light. You have the right to remain silent, Ashford continued. You have the right to legal counsel. If you cannot afford— I can afford it, Iris whispered. She was looking at her father. Victor didn't look back. The steel cuffs clicked shut like a vault door closing. Iris's hands trembled as Agent Ashford guided them behind her back. Dwight lunged forward, screaming her name, but Bobby stepped between them with the easy authority of someone who'd spent 43 years not taking orders from his cousin. Victor didn't move, just stared at his daughter like she was a failed acquisition. 25 years of pursuing my recipes and his own daughter had just handed the FBI evidence that would dismantle everything he'd tried to build through her marriage to my son. Iris's voice cut through the chaos like broken glass. I'm not taking the fall for your embezzlement alone. Agent Ashford had her by the arm, guiding her toward the south exit where a federal vehicle was waiting. But Iris twisted back toward the room, toward Dwight, hands cuffed behind her back, and face twisted with the kind of rage that only comes when you realize you've been used. You forged the contracts, Iris spat. You diverted the funds. You practiced the signature for 2 weeks while I watched and said nothing because you told me it was for us, for our future. Dwight stood frozen. Bobby had stepped aside, no longer blocking him because there was nowhere left to go. No escape route. No federal exit he could slip through while everyone else took the blame. He looked at his wife in handcuffs, at the FBI agents positioned at every door, at the Navy folder spread open on the white linen, with 9 years of signed acknowledgments proving he'd always known he owned nothing, at the investors who'd stopped looking at him entirely. Then finally he turned his eyes to me. I saw something I hadn't seen in 3 years, maybe longer. Fear, not the corporate calculation kind, not the strategic risk assessment that business school teaches you to mask with confidence. Real fear. The kind a child feels when the world gets too big and too cold, and the only person who can make it right is the parent standing in front of them. For one brief second, maybe two, I saw the scared little boy who used to wake up from nightmares calling for his mother, the kid who'd cried in my arms when his Little League team lost the championship, the son who'd asked me at 14 if I thought he'd ever be good enough to run the company I'd built with his mother. Dwight opened his mouth. Dad, his voice cracked. The room held its breath. 60 people, 2 FBI agents, 1 civil attorney, and a nephew who knew exactly what was balanced on the edge of that unfinished sentence. I waited. Waited for, I'm sorry. Waited for, I failed you. Waited for any acknowledgement that the man standing in front of me understood what he'd destroyed. Not just the company, not just the contracts and his client relationships and 44 years of recipes, but us. The thing Rose and I had tried to build alongside the business, a family that meant something. Dwight's hands were shaking. He looked down at them like they belonged to someone else. The silence stretched like a rope about to break. I saw the exact moment it happened, saw his face shift from vulnerability back into armor, saw the corporate mask slide back into place like a helmet locking shut, saw the scared little boy disappear behind 38 years of business school conditioning and Victor Greer's poisonous mentoring, and Iris's whispered ambitions in the dark. When Dwight looked up again, his eyes were different. Cold, calculated, survival mode. I want a lawyer, he said. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I failed you. Not, Dad, I need help. Just 5 words. Corporate armor, legal defense, the final choice between accountability and strategy. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not anger, not even disappointment anymore. Just the quiet, devastating acceptance that the son Rose and I had raised was gone. Had been gone for years, probably, and the man standing in his place had just chosen to defend himself rather than face what he'd become. I gave him a slow nod. Estelle, I said quietly. Estelle Lang stood from her seat beside me. She'd been watching the whole exchange with the calm assessment of someone who'd witnessed 1,000 similar moments in depositions and courtrooms. She knew what that 5-word choice meant. Mr. Dwight Sutton, Estelle said, voice carrying across the silent room. I no longer represent you. I represent your father and Rose's Premier Catering LLC, the company he owns 100% of. You'll need to retain independent legal counsel. Given the federal charges, I recommend contacting the public defender's office for Travis County." Dwight's face went pale. He'd expected what? That I'd use my attorney to defend him, that Estelle would build a case to protect the son who'd forged my signature and stolen my company. The look between them was a door closing for the last time. "The state will assign you representation," Estelle continued. "Agent Ashford can provide you with contact information for federal public defenders who specialize in white-collar criminal defense." She sat back down, opened the Navy folder to a fresh tab, moved on. Dwight looked at me one last time. I looked back. No anger, no fury, no 44 years of betrayal boiling over into the kind of confrontation he might have been expecting. Just quiet, sorrowful acceptance. The same look I'd given Rose's coffin when they lowered it into the ground in 2017. The look you give something precious that's gone forever and isn't coming back no matter how hard you wish it would. I saw him register it, saw him understand that this wasn't a negotiation or a business dispute or something that could be fixed with the right legal strategy. This was the end, the permanent, irrevocable severing of everything we'd been, father and son, partners in building something that mattered. Family, all of it gone, ended not with rage or violence, but with 5 words spoken in corporate armor instead of human vulnerability. Dwight's shoulders sagged, not in defeat, in something worse, resignation. The acceptance that he'd made his choice and would have to live with it. He turned away, not toward Iris, who was being escorted out by Agent Ashford, not toward Victor, who was staring at his folded hands like they held answers they didn't, not toward the investors or the employees or anyone who might offer support. Just away, toward the field agent standing near the north exit, toward federal investigation and criminal charges and whatever came next, for a man who'd chosen survival over soul. Bobby's hand found my shoulder, warm, solid, the kind of steadiness Rose used to provide when the world felt like it was sliding sideways. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded. It wasn't true, but it was the answer that mattered. Across the room, Agent Ashford returned from escorting Iris to the vehicle. She scanned the remaining crowd with professional efficiency, then her eyes settled on someone near the back table. I watched my son turn away, not in anger, not in defiance, just in the cold calculation of a man who'd chosen survival over soul. Bobby's hand found my shoulder. The warmth was small comfort. I stood at the head of the room and cleared my throat. Bobby's hand was still on my shoulder, warm and steady. Dwight had disappeared through the north exit with a field agent. Iris was already in a federal vehicle. Victor and Eleanor sat 3 chairs down, staring at nothing. The investors had gone quiet, phones out, probably texting their legal teams. 60 people waiting to see what came next. I looked at Estelle. She gave me a small nod. "The Meridian contract executed by Dwight Sutton is null and void," I said. My voice carried across the silent room with the same steadiness I'd used to teach young cooks how to manage a smoker for 16 hours straight. He lacked actual authority to bind the company. "Monday morning at 9 a.m., I will personally execute a new legally binding contract with the Meridian Group, one that protects our recipes, our brand, and our people." One of the California investors, the woman who'd been sitting beside Elena, looked up from her phone. "Effective immediately." I continued. "Dwight R. Sutton's position as managing operator is terminated for cause under Article 7 of the operating agreement. Ms. Lang has filed official removal notice with the Texas Secretary of State. The company will continue operations without interruption." Estelle pulled a document from the Navy folder, held it up briefly so the room could see the state seal. I turned my attention to the back of the room, where Nola Crane sat alone at a small table near the kitchen partition. She'd stayed after her confession, probably because she had nowhere else to go. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her fingers, white-knuckled with tension. "Nola Crane," I said clearly. "Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., call Opal Flynn. She'll be waiting for you. Your position is fully secure. Your health insurance is fully secure. Your employment contract remains in effect with 0 modifications." Nola's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak. Opal Flynn, veteran restaurant manager, 51 years old, the same woman who discovered the initial fraud back in May and built the forensic accounting case that made tonight possible, would be taking over as director of operations Monday morning. She'd run successful kitchens in Houston and San Antonio for 20 years before I'd brought her on 6 months ago to help me understand exactly how deep Dwight's betrayal went. Now, she'd help rebuild what he'd tried to destroy. One signature, 40 years, forever protected. The room stayed quiet. Not the shocked silence from earlier when the FBI had walked in. This was different. Attentive. Waiting. Estelle flipped to the final page in the navy folder. The paper was cream-colored heavy stock, freshly notarized. She slid it across the white linen to where I stood. Official assignment of membership interest. Estelle said, voice clear and formal. Rose's Premier Catering LLC to the Rose Cole Family Trust. Dated November 7th, 2023. Notarized this evening at 6:47 p.m. Before the party, before the FBI, before Dwight's world collapsed. I'd signed the preliminary documents 3 days ago in Estelle's office, sitting in the same leather chair where she'd first showed me the Navy folder 6 months earlier. But this one, this final assignment, needed to be witnessed, needed to be public, needed to happen here in front of everyone who'd watched my son try to erase me from the company my wife and I had built together. I picked up the pen Estelle offered, black ink heavy weight, the kind that makes a permanent mark. My hand was steady, no tremor, no hesitation, just 44 years of certainty about what mattered. I signed Arthur James Sutton. The scratch of pen on paper sounded like a door opening. Bobby Sutton is named Master Trustee and Primary Beneficiary. Estelle continued reading from the trust document. The trust stipulates a perpetual scholarship fund for underprivileged young cooks in the state of Texas, 10% of annual revenue administered through the Texas Culinary Institute. The fund will prioritize candidates from underserved communities who demonstrate commitment to traditional smoking and barbecue techniques. Bobby's eyes had gone wide. He was staring at the document like it was written in a language he didn't quite understand. The company, I said quietly, looking at my nephew Rose's sister's son, the boy who'd spent summers in our kitchen, learning to break down brisket the right way, is being renamed. Effective Monday, November 10th, 2023. Rose's Premier Catering becomes Rose's Table, LLC. Bobby's eyes pooled with tears. He didn't try to hide them. I placed my hand on his shoulder, the same way Rose used to do when one of us needed steadying, the same way my father Earl had done when he'd handed me that folding knife in 1971 and told me to build something that mattered. Your mother set this table 40 years ago, I said, not loud, not performing for the room, just telling Bobby the truth he needed to hear. She taught me that feeding people wasn't about profit margins or investor returns. It was about showing up every day and doing the work with your whole heart. I'm making sure the right people sit at it. The tears on Bobby's face caught the light like a promise kept. He stood, wrapped his arms around me, not the careful, respectful embrace of a nephew to an elder, but the desperate, grateful hold of someone who'd just been given something they didn't know they needed. His shoulders shook. I held him steady. When he finally pulled back, his voice came out rough. Uncle Arthur, and she'd want you to have it, I said simply. Not Dwight, you, the one who actually learned what she was teaching. Estelle gathered the signed documents, placed them carefully back in the Navy folder. The scholarship fund, the trust assignment, the company rename, 44 years of building something real, now protected in perpetuity from the kind of poison that had consumed my son. The room sat in dead silence, not stunned, not shocked, just reverent. No one applauded. The weight of what had just happened transcended noise. This wasn't a celebration. This was a reckoning, a transformation, the end of one legacy and the careful, intentional birth of another. Reed Nash stood from his seat near the kitchen partition. He didn't say anything, just pressed his hand to his heart and bowed his head, the gesture pitmasters use when acknowledging someone who'd taught them everything that mattered. The weight of what I'd done settled over the room, like smoke from a 16-hour cook. Permanent, irreversible. Right. Reed caught me at my truck in the parking lot. The reverent silence inside the Ember Room had broken into quiet departures. Investors gathering coats, employees processing what they'd witnessed, Agent Ashford coordinating with field agents about evidence collection. Bobby was still inside talking with Estelle about Monday's transition timeline. I'd needed air, needed space, needed to get to my truck before the weight of what I'd done settled too heavy to carry. Reed stood in his white dress shirt sleeves, still rolled to the elbows, smelling of butter and smoke and time. The sense of a working kitchen. The sense of 44 years. Chef, he said quietly. I stopped with my hand on the truck door, turned to face him. You good? Reed asked. The question was simple. The answer wasn't. I will be, I said. Reed nodded. He understood what that meant. Not good now, maybe not good for a long time, but eventually the kind of okay that comes when you do what honor demands, even when it costs everything. I studied his face. 63 years old now, gray at the temples lines around his eyes from decades of squinting through smoke. But the kid I'd taught to break down his first brisket at 19 was still there, buried under the years, and success, and the restaurant empire he'd built. "You still keep that old tartare recipe exactly the way I wrote it?" I asked. Reed's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Haven't changed a single measurement in 20 years, chef. Still hand-chop the beef. Still use the cornichons you specified. Still plate it the same way." "Don't," I said, "ever." Wasn't planning to. The November wind cut across the parking lot, carrying the smell of Houston at night exhaust and food trucks and the distant Gulf. We stood there in the yellow glow of the security lights, two men who'd built their lives around fire and smoke, and the quiet satisfaction of feeding people who needed feeding. "That $50,000 check you wrote me in 1989. Reed said. "I paid it back in 1994. You remember what you did?" as asked. I remembered. "Send it back," I said. "Told you it was a gift, not a loan. You wrote on the envelope, 'You earned this kitchen. Don't insult it by treating it like debt.'" Reed stepped back. Then he did something I hadn't seen in 30 years, the formal bow. Not the casual nod chefs give each other at competitions or trade shows, the real one. The profound traditional bow a culinary apprentice gives to the master teacher who opened the first door and trusted them to walk through it. He held it for 3 full seconds, head bowed back, straight hands at his sides. When he straightened, his eyes were wet. "Thank you, chef," Reed said, "for everything." My throat went tight. "You did the work, Reed. You gave me the kitchen." The bow was a bridge across 20 years of gratitude. I reached out, gripped his shoulder the way Earl used to grip mine when words weren't enough. Reed covered my hand with his, held it there for a moment, then stepped back. "Monday morning," he said. 9 a.m., I'll be there when you sign the new Meridian contract. Witness signature if you need it." "Appreciate that." Reed walked back toward the restaurant. I watched him go, white shirt disappearing into the Ember Room's warm light, back to the kitchen where he belonged. Back to the legacy I'd helped him build by giving him space to build it. I climbed into my truck and drove home. The ranch was dark when I pulled in at 1:30 a.m. November in Brenham gets cold at night, 58 degrees dry. The kind of quiet that makes you hear every cricket and tree frog for miles. The stove light was on the way. I'd left it 6 hours ago when I'd driven to Houston for my son's anniversary party. The Navy folder sat on the oak kitchen table. I'd brought it home from the Ember Room, all the documents safely inside, the trust assignment, the scholarship fund, the company rename. 44 years of work transformed into something that might outlive me. I reached into my jacket pocket, not for Earl's knife this time, for the navy velvet box. Rose's watch caught the stovelight when I opened the lid. Platinum case, sapphire markers. That inscription on the back, A and R forever, 1982. I'd carried this to the party thinking I might give it to Dwight. Rose's letter had said to give it to our son when he was ready to carry what we'd built. But he wasn't ready. Would never be ready. Had chosen forgery and fraud and corporate armor over the simple human act of saying, "I'm sorry." I'd thought about giving it to Bobby after I'd signed the trust documents. He'd earned it. He understood what Rose had been teaching. He'd carry the legacy forward at Rose's table with the same integrity she'd shown for 23 years. But I didn't give it to him either. I walked to our bedroom, the room Rose and I had shared for 36 years before cancer took her in 2017. Her nightstand still held the reading glasses she'd worn for recipe development, the novel she'd been reading when she got too sick to hold the pages, the small ceramic dish where she'd kept her earrings. I placed the velvet box deep in the back of her drawer, closed it, let it rest there unearned by either son, one who'd betrayed everything it represented, one who deserved it, but didn't need it to know he was valued. My victory was complete. The company was protected. Bobby would carry it forward. Dwight would face federal charges. Justice had been served. But the family was still broken. The watch was still unearned. Rose was still gone. I poured a glass of water from the tap and sat at the oak table in the silence of a man who'd done what honor demanded, knowing it didn't make the hurt less. Above me, mounted on the wall, where it had been for 52 years, rested Earl's folding knife. The one he'd given me in 1971 when I was 16. The one that had traveled through 44 years of building something real. 52 years, one knife, zero complaints. I stared at it for a long time. Then I turned off the stove light and went to bed. The house went dark. Somewhere in Houston, Dwight was probably still awake, probably still searching for exits that didn't exist anymore. I wasn't searching for anything. Monday morning arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. I'd slept 4 hours. Woke at 6, made coffee, sat at the oak table, watching November sunlight spread across the Brenham fields. The Navy folder sat where I'd left it, documents signed and sealed. By tonight, everything would be different. Estelle called at 9:02. Removal notice filed and confirmed, she said. No preamble, no celebration. Just the mechanical precision of legal execution. Texas Secretary of State has recorded Dwight R. Sutton's termination as managing operator of Rose's Premier Catering LLC, effective immediately. Public record as of 9:01 a.m. Thank you, Estelle. The Meridian Group is expecting you at 10. I drove to Houston, same route I'd taken Friday night for the anniversary party. Same truck, same highway, same exit. But the weight in my chest was different, lighter. Not happy I'd lost my son 3 days ago, and that wound would take years to stop bleeding, but purposeful. Forward moving. The Meridian Group's Houston office occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower in the Galleria district. Their executive vice president, Thomas Caldwell, 47, Yale, MBA. The same man who'd been copied on Dwight's forged contract, met me in the conference room with 2 attorneys and a fresh contract packet. Mr. Sutton, Caldwell said, extending his hand. Welcome back to the table. I shook it. Let's make this right. The new contract took 40 minutes to review. Same basic terms as Dwight's version: operational partnership, revenue sharing, geographic expansion, but stripped of the clauses that would have transferred recipe ownership and brand control. The deal value stayed at $2.8 million over 3 years. My signature went on every page that mattered. At 10:47 a.m., I signed the final execution page. My real signature, not practiced, not forged, not stolen. Just the same loops and slants I'd been writing for 68 years. Caldwell witnessed it. Estelle notarized it. The Meridian attorneys filed it electronically with their corporate office before I'd even left the building. 3 hours, 3 years undone. I called Opal Flynn from the parking garage. It's done, I said. The Meridian contract is executed under proper authority. You're promoted to interim operations manager effective immediately. Full operational authority. Full hiring and firing discretion. You answer to me, and the trust nobody else. Opal's voice came through steady professional. Understood. I'll have the transition memo distributed to all staff by end of business today. One more thing, I said. Nola Crane. Already handled. I restructured her health insurance this morning, full coverage maintained regardless of employment status changes. Paid maternity leave authorized under Pregnancy Discriminations Act protections. 16 weeks starting whenever she needs it. Good. I drove home, got there by noon, made lunch I didn't eat, sat in the silence of a man who just reclaimed 44 years of work in 3 hours of signatures. The FBI came at 2 p.m. I wasn't there to see it, but Opal called me with the update at 2:34. Agent Ashford had arrived with 4 field agents and a federal warrant authorizing seizure of Rose's Premier Catering servers. Financial records and communication devices covering the period from January 2021 through November 2023. 3 years of evidence. 3 years of Dwight's fraud documented in emails and bank transfers and forged contracts. They had loaded everything into federal evidence vehicles within 90 minutes. Dwight was arrested at 4:17 p.m., booked at the Harris County Federal Facility on charges of wire fraud, contract forgery, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. Bail was set at $150,000 paid from his personal accounts, not mine, because he didn't have access to mine anymore. Iris faced separate federal investigation for criminal misappropriation of trade secrets. No arrest yet, but Agent Ashford had made it clear that charges were coming pending analysis of Bobby's recording and the buyer's cooperation testimony. Victor Greer pulled all capital from Houston investment deals within 2 weeks. The financial press covered it briefly. Greer Hospitality Group exits Houston market amid family scandal, but the real damage happened quietly. Reputation shattered. Partnership offers withdrawn. The 25-year pursuit of my recipes ending not with acquisition, but with public humiliation. Eleanor filed for legal separation on November 28th. Quiet, methodical. no press coverage. By early December, the machine had finished its work. Federal charges filed, civil cases prepared, corporate structure restored. Every person who had participated in Dwight's fraud either facing prosecution or fleeing the wreckage. And on December 12th, 2023, the signage changed. I stood on the sidewalk outside our main headquarters, building the one Rose and I had opened in 1998, the one that had grown from food truck to empire over 44 years, and watched the installation crew remove the old letters. Rose's premier catering came down piece by piece. 25 years of branding, 25 years of my wife's mother's name marking the building she'd helped us buy. The new letters went up in fresh brass, each one catching the December morning light over the Houston skyline. Rose's Table LLC. Simpler, more direct, more honest about what we'd always been, not a catering company trying to impress investors, but a table where people gathered to be fed. Opal stood beside me, tablet in hand, reviewing the day's schedule. Nola was inside at her desk, 4 months along, now position secure and benefits protected. Bobby had driven in from Brenham to witness the installation camera phone, out to document the moment for the trust records. The new brass letters gleamed like a promise finally kept. "She'd like this," I said quietly. Opal glanced at me. "Rose, yeah, she'd be proud," Opal said, "of what you protected, of what you're building." I nodded, couldn't quite speak past the tightness in my throat. Every thread resolved, every promise honored, Dwight facing federal prosecution, Iris under investigation, Victor's empire crumbling, Nola protected with health insurance and paid leave, the company renamed and restructured as a family trust, with perpetual scholarship funding, Bobby positioned to carry it forward, justice complete, legacy restored. But Rose was still gone. Dwight was still lost. The victory was still hollow at its center no matter how right the outcome. I stood on the sidewalk in December, cold looking up at Rose's Table, LLC in fresh brass. The building looked the same, the city looked the same, but the name was finally right. After Christmas dinner, I placed the navy velvet box before Bobby. We'd eaten at my ranch just the three of us, Bobby, his wife Sarah, and me. Sarah had made pecan pie using Rose's recipe, the one written on a grease-stained index card that lived in the kitchen drawer for 40 years. The coffee was strong and dark. The fire in the hearth burned clean, and for 2 hours we'd sat in the kind of comfortable silence that only comes when people don't need to perform for each other. Bobby stared at the box, his breath caught. Sarah, quiet presence, warm eyes, the kind of woman who understood when to speak and when to simply be there, placed her hand on his shoulder. "Rose told me something 1 week before she died," I said quietly. We were sitting in the hospital room, just the two of us. She couldn't talk much. By then the cancer had taken most of her strength, but she pointed to her wrist where she used to wear this watch, and she said, "Give it to the one who understands what family means." Bobby's eyes were wet. "She didn't specify which son," I continued. "Didn't say Dwight's name, didn't say yours. She just said, the one who understands. Because she knew. Even back in 2017, 6 years before everything fell apart, she already knew which of you would carry what we'd built forward and which would try to tear it down for parts." I pushed the box across the oak table. "Open it." Bobby's hands trembled as he lifted the lid. The watch caught the Firelight Platinum case, sapphire markers, the inscription on the back, visible even from where I sat, A and R forever, 1982. He didn't take it out, just stared at it like he was looking at Rose herself. "Dad," his voice cracked. He'd started calling me that 3 weeks ago, right after I'd signed the trust documents. Not uncle. Dad. "I'm so sorry about Dwight." "I know, son." We sat in beautiful, comfortable silence. Rose was there in the pie, in the coffee, in the warmth that ran deeper than the fire could account for. Not gone, never gone. Just present in a different way. Bobby finally lifted the watch from its velvet bed and fastened it around his wrist. It fit perfectly. 3 days later, I walked through the doors of Rose's Table LLC for the first time as the restored owner and founder. The bronze letters above the entrance gleamed in the late December sun, new, clean, honest. A small card sat on the reception counter, Reed's handwriting unmistakable even from across the lobby. "Congratulations, chef. The right name is finally on the right door." Opal had organized a small gathering. 20 employees, coffee and pastries on the break room counter, respectful nods instead of applause. These were kitchen people. They understood that real work happened quietly with your head down and your hands busy. I tied a classic white apron around my waist, the same way I'd done for 52 years, and stepped into the test kitchen. The inventory ledger sat where it always had thick and worn pages marked with grease stains and recipe notes in Rose's handwriting. I pulled it open and began counting. Flour, sugar, salt, butter, brisket inventory, smoking wood. Reserve sauce component stock levels. The numbers made sense. The patterns held. I still knew exactly how to run a kitchen. The bronze letters gleamed like a chapter finally closed. New Year's Eve arrived cold and clear. I sat in the wooden rocking chair on my back porch watching the final sunset of 2023 bleed orange and purple across the Texas horizon. Hot black coffee in a chipped mug. No fireworks planned, no party, just wind and stars and the quiet that comes when you've done everything you set out to do. I thought about Rose, about Earl handing me that folding knife in 1971 and telling me to build something that mattered, about 19-year-old Reed learning to break down his first brisket, about Bobby wearing Rose's watch on his wrist, carrying the company forward as master trustee of a family legacy that would outlive all of us. I thought about Nola, safe and employed, preparing to bring a child into the world with health insurance and paid leave, about Opal running operations with the same methodical precision Rose had used, about the scholarship fund that would give 10% of our revenue to kids who needed a kitchen to belong to. I thought about Dwight, but only for a moment, only long enough to acknowledge what was lost and then let it go. The stars came out one by one, cold and bright and permanent. I went inside and picked up Earl's knife from its place on the wall, 52 years old. The hickory handle was cracked from decades of use, the blade worn thin from thousands of sharpenings. But it still held an edge, still did the work it was made for. I set it flat on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Then I turned my head, looked straight out, not at the knife, not at the walls, but at you, at the person hearing this story, at everyone who's ever been erased from something they built, dismissed by someone they trusted, betrayed by someone they loved. And I spoke the truth Rose always knew. A quiet man isn't a weak man, I said. He's just a man who knows the difference between a moment worth raising your voice for and a moment worth raising the paperwork for. I raised the paperwork, filed the removal notices, signed the trust documents, secured the evidence, let the FBI and the attorneys in the federal courts do the shouting while I kept my head down and my hands steady. Rose would have approved, I said quietly. She would have. She'd built her whole life on the same principle, quiet strength, methodical planning work that spoke louder than words ever could. I picked up Earl's knife one more time, felt the weight of it, felt 52 years of building something real, protecting something precious, and finally making sure it went to someone who deserved it. The knife rested on the wood. The stars burned cold over Texas. I closed my eyes and smiled. 68 years old, founder, father, chef. The story was finally over. And to you, listening to my story, remember this quiet strength isn't about staying silent. It's about choosing your battles with wisdom. Don't make my mistake of assuming blood guarantees loyalty. I should have seen the signs earlier. I should have documented everything from the beginning, not just the last 6 months. I gave Dwight access because he was my son, and I trusted him to honor what his mother and I built together. That trust nearly cost me everything Rose and I worked 44 years to create. If you're facing something similar, someone taking credit for your work, erasing your legacy, betraying your trust, document everything, this isn't just about dad family revenge. It's about protecting what you built. Raise the paperwork, not your voice. Federal courts don't care about who shouts loudest. They care about evidence. I believe God put me through this to show that a dad's family revenge doesn't need to be loud to be complete. When you're ready, justice will find its way. What do you think? Was I right to give the watch to Bobby instead of Dwight? Should a father's legacy go to blood or to the one who honors it? Drop your thoughts below. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about quiet justice, subscribe to Dad's Calm Revenge. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Remember, some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling and reflection purposes. What matters most is the lesson quiet men don't need to shout to win. They just need the truth and the paperwork to prove it.